Between 1500 and 1350 BCE, a number of states emerged across the eastern Mediterranean. Each of these states developed due to internal dynamics, often driven by the ambitions and leadership of individual kings. They rose from the instability of the previous era, often referred to as a dark age, first securing control over their core territories before turning to expansion. These expansions inevitably sparked conflicts among neighboring powers, shaping the region's history into a series of wars and rivalries. Key powers regularly changed. Initially, it was Egypt versus Mitanni, followed by Egypt and the Hittites, and later the Hittites and the Assyrians. Much of this conflict centered around Syria, a contested frontier between empires. But tensions weren't confined to Syria alone. In the east, Elam, Babylonia, and Assyria clashed with one another, while in the west, the Mycenaeans came into conflict with the Hittites. One example of these power struggles is the history of Mitanni. Among the earliest to rise, the Mitanni kingdom dominated northern Syria for roughly 150 years. Its main rival early on was Egypt. However, Egypt's northern military campaigns never crossed the Euphrates River. Doing so would have meant invading the core of Mitanni territory. Instead, the two powers competed indirectly, each trying to gain influence over client states in northwestern Syria. Their rivalry came to an end shortly before 1400 BCE, when the Egyptian king Amenhotep II, ruling from 1426 to 1400 BCE, married the daughter of the Mitanni king Artatama. Even 50 years later, Mitanni still held significant influence, and Egypt's kings treated Tushratta, Mitanni's ruler at the time, as their equal. Still, diplomatic letters from this period, known as the Amarna letters, reveal unrest within Mitanni. Different branches of the royal family vied for control, and their internal struggles spilled onto the international stage as each faction sought outside support. The resulting situation was chaotic. What we know comes primarily from foreign sources, as internal Mitanni records are scarce. Late in the reign of Amenhotep III, 1390 to 1353 BCE, Tushratta wrote to the Egyptian king, addressing him as a friend. While the letter mainly served to announce the arrival of gifts for Amenhotep and his wife, Keluhiba Tushratta's sisterhood also included a personal account of how Tushratta came to power. When I inherited the throne from my father, I was still young. Yuthi had committed many wrongs in my land. He had murdered his king. Because of this, he isolated me from forming alliances with anyone who might have supported me. But I did not turn a blind eye to these crimes. I took action and executed the murderers of my brother Arteshamara, along with all their followers. Because you were my father's ally, I'm writing to let you know what happened, so that you, my brother, may hear it and be glad. My father loved you, and you loved him. Out of that bond he gave you my sister in marriage. Who else had such a relationship with my father? Tushratta had been placed on the throne of Mitanni by Uthitha, the very man who had murdered his brother, but he later turned on Yuthi and killed him. In his letter to Egypt, Tushratta sought to strengthen diplomatic ties, but his position remained unstable. Challenged his authority and declared himself king with support from the Hittite ruler Suppiluliuma. Artatama's son, Shotarna III, assassinated Tushratta and seized control of the royal palace. The version of events we know best comes from the side that ultimately gained power. Though at the cost of aligning with the Hittites, the source is a treaty between Shatawaza, the son of Tushratta and new king of Mitanni, and Suppiluliuma IV. This treaty survives in two versions, one told from Shatawaza's perspective and the other from Suppiluliuma's. Both were written in Hittite and Babylonian and preserved in the Hittite capital's archives. Each version recounts the events differently, which adds complexity but also gives a more complete picture of the political and military chaos of the time. In the historical preamble to the treaty, Shatawaza recounts, before Shotarna, son of Artatama, disrupted the order in Mitanni, his father had already acted dishonorably. Artatama gave away the royal palace and its treasures to Assyria and Alsh. That palace once built and filled with riches by my father. King Tushratta was stripped bare and destroyed by Shatarna. He dismantled the symbols of royalty, melted down gold and silver, and even took the silver basins from the royal bath. He gave nothing to his father or brother, but instead bowed down to the Assyrian king, who had once been a servant of my father and no longer paid tribute and sent him lavish gifts. In doing so, he brought about the downfall of the Hurrian people. Akitasheb fled from him to the land of Kardunish Babylonia, taking 200 chariots with him. But the Babylonian king seized both the men and their possessions and reduced Akitasheb's status, treating him like a common charioteer. He even tried to kill him. Ishatawaza, son of King Tushrata, was also targeted for assassination, but managed to escape. I called upon the gods of your majesty, Supaloliama, the great king of Hatti, the beloved champion of the storm god Teshub. The gods led me safely on a road without direction. The deities of Hatti and Mitanni guided me until I reached your majesty, Supaloliama, great king of Hatti, favored of Teshub. Shatawuza's account tells the following story. To secure his hold on the throne, Shatarna, son of Artatama, sided with the Assyrians, who had once been under Mitanni's influence. He took over the palace built by Tushrata and used its treasures to win favor with Assyria. He also purged the kingdom's military leadership. One commander, Akitasheb, managed to escape to Babylonia with 200 chariots and took Shatawaza with him. However, the Babylonian king, likely Burnaburiash, confiscated everything and tried to kill both Akitasheb and Shatawaza. They managed to flee and eventually reached the court of the Hittite king, Suppiluma. The treaty continues by describing what happened after Shatawaza arrived in the Hittite court, empty-handed and in exile. Supiluma welcomed him and offered military support, assigning his son, Prince Piasili, to aid him. Together, they sent emissaries to various Mitanni cities, trying to form alliances. However, Shatarna III had already bribed many locals to support his claim to power. As a result, Shatawaza and Piasili had to fight, and they succeeded in capturing several cities in northern Syria. When the Assyrians later besieged the Mitanni capital, Washukani, the people there turned to Shatawaza and Piasili for help. Their arrival forced the Assyrian army to retreat. Unfortunately, the final part of the story, including Shatarna's defeat, has been lost. After his victory, Shatawaza became a vassal of Supiluma, but he retained a degree of honor and status. Mitanni wasn't reduced to a mere client state. Instead, it became a protectorate, which allowed Shatawaza to present his rise to power with dignity. Still, Supilum's version of events paints a different picture. He portrays himself as a triumphant conqueror who chose a royal Mitanni figure to act as his representative. He describes Tushatawaza's father as an arrogant ally who became angry when Hittite raids reached west of the Euphrates. Supiluma claims he crossed into Mitanni territory, plundered Washukani, and caused Tushrata to flee. After this, the Hittites launched a major campaign throughout the region west of the Euphrates. The turning point came with a palace coup in Mitanni. Shatarna III, son of Artatama II, murdered Tushrata and took the throne with Assyrian backing. He also tried to kill Shatawaza, who escaped and sought refuge with Supiluma. According to the Hittite king, the god Teshub is rendered judgment. Because I took Shatawaza, son of King Tushrata, under my protection, I will place him on his father's throne, so that the great land of Mitanni would not be destroyed. I, the great king of Hatti, gave life back to it for the sake of my daughter. I took Shatawaza by the hand and gave him my daughter as his wife. By this point, Supiluma had firmly established military control over Syria west of the Euphrates and held dominance over Mitanni's king. Although he originally supported the royal line of Artatama II, that alliance collapsed when its members sided with Assyria. In response, Supiluma shifted his support to Tushrata's son. His success, however, was short-lived. Death. A devastating plague struck the Hittite kingdom, and Shatawaza severed ties with the Hittites. Without his cooperation, he could no longer influence Mitanni's affairs. In the late 14th century BCE, the Hittite king Murseli II ruling 1321 to 1295, lamented, "The nearby protectorates, Mitanni and Arzawa, have all risen in revolt. They no longer honor the gods. They have broken sacred oaths and seek to plunder the temples. May this give the gods even more reason for vengeance. Let them send plagues, rebellion, famine, and deadly disease upon Mitanni and Arzawa." Pressure on Mitanni from Assyria had already begun during the reign of Suppilulium's contemporary, Suar-Ubalid I, ruling 1363 to 1328. Though not mentioned directly in the treaties, his actions triggered Hittite involvement in Mitanni's internal politics. Assur-Ubalid likely broke Assyria free from Mitanni's control, and then tried to interfere in its royal succession. The Hittites' response seemed to have ended that influence temporarily. But after Suppilulium's death, Assyria may have regained dominance over Mitanni. This is how the Assyrian king Adad-nirari, ruling 1305 to 1274, portrayed the situation in one of his inscriptions. Referring to Mitanni as Hanigalbat, he wrote, "When Shatura, king of Hanigalbat, rebelled and committed evil acts, I captured him and brought him to my city, Osur, under the command of my god Osur and the other great gods who guide me. I made him swear an oath and sent him back to his land. Long as he lived, he paid me annual tribute in Osur. After his death, his son Wasashata also rebelled and did evil. He turned to the Hittites for help, offering them bribes. But the Hittites accepted the gifts and gave him no support. Shatuara. I was likely the son of Shatuaza. And according to the account of the Assyrian king Adad-nirari, he became a vassal of the Assyrian Empire. When his own son, Wasashata, rebelled, he appealed to the Hittites for support. However, they were preoccupied with their own conflict against Egypt and provided no assistance. Adad-nirari launched a military campaign across Mitanni, advancing all the way to the Euphrates. He captured Wasashata and his family and brought them back to Assur, although Adad-nirari claimed to have brought the entire population under his control. His successor, Shalmaneser, the first ruling 1273 to 1244 BCE, still had to send another army to the region. It's time to face a new leader, Shatuara II. Despite receiving aid from the Hittites and the Elamu nomads, Shatuara II was defeated. Shalmaneser, I describe the campaign in dramatic terms, by command of the great gods and with the mighty strength of Assur. My lord, I marched to Hanigalbat. I opened paths and crossed difficult terrain. Shtuara, king of Hanigalbat, along with the armies of Hatti and the Elamu, had blocked the mountain passes and taken control of my water sources. When my soldiers were exhausted and parched, their forces launched a fierce attack, but I pushed them back and defeated them. I slaughtered a great number of their troops. I pursued their king with arrows until nightfall. I butchered the armies of Hatti and the Elamu like sheep. With this, Mitanni's independence effectively ended. Its territory was divided. The Hittites controlled the lands west of the Euphrates, while the Assyrians took control of the eastern side. Syria then used the region as a base for military campaigns heading north and west. These conflicts continued through the end of the 13th century. Tukulti-Ninurta, the first ruling 1243 to 1207 BCE, even crossed the Euphrates to wage war against the Hittites. And the rivalry between the two powers came to define life in northern Syria during this time. The Assyrians maintained their control east of the Euphrates by establishing administrative centers and systematically exploiting the land. However, this rule came to an end after Tukulti-Ninurta's assassination, which triggered a period of chaos in Assyria. As a result, the Mitanni region briefly regained independence, but without any unified political structure. The biggest beneficiaries of this instability were the Arameans, who eventually came to dominate northern Syria politically. The history of Mitanni clearly illustrates how internal politics within one kingdom could become a matter of international importance. A dynastic rivalry between two branches of the royal family provided an opening for foreign powers to interfere. Each side in the conflict sought outside support, and in turn, foreign allies could shift their loyalties depending on what was most advantageous at the time. Mitanni factions themselves were not consistent either. They changed allegiance when it suited their interests or attempted to cast off foreign influence whenever possible. When a foreign backer was distracted by other matters, support would vanish. While Mitanni's transformation from a powerful kingdom to a dependent protectorate was significant. The phenomenon itself wasn't unique. Similar patterns of internal conflict drawing in external powers occurred throughout the region. No kingdom in this period existed in isolation. The broader context was one of ongoing competition between major states, though direct confrontations were rare. Instead, powers like the Hittites and Assyrians fought proxy wars by backing opposing sides in local conflicts. This dynamic was common not only in Mitanni, but also in the Syro-Palestinian region and beyond, continuing for centuries. There was, however, one important exception to this pattern: the Battle of Kadesh, the road to Kadesh, most well known. Battle of this entire era was fought between the Hittite king Muwatalli and his Egyptian counterpart, Ramesses II, near the city of Kadesh in central Syria. This battle, which took place in 1275 BCE, marked the climax of a prolonged struggle between Egypt and the Hittite Empire over control of the Syro-Palestine region. Although Ramesses II suffered a defeat or at best fought to a stalemate, he later turned the confrontation at Kadesh into a symbol of glory. He immortalized it through detailed accounts and grand depictions on temples and monuments, making it the first battle in world history from which we have such a rich and detailed narrative. For historians, the significance of the Battle of Kadesh lies in the fact that it was a direct military confrontation between two great powers, Egypt and Hatti, rather than a proxy war fought through smaller allied states. Up until then, most major late Bronze Age conflicts had been fought indirectly. The battle was all but inevitable. The Hittite expansion into Syria, begun under Suppiluliuma, had been both deliberate and highly successful. His heirs continued the fight to hold on to the territory he had won, resisting repeated Egyptian attempts to push back. Suppilulium's campaign had started in the mid-14th century BCE, shortly after he ascended to the throne. He first secured the region bordering Anatolia and Syria, then pressured the northern Syrian city-states to abandon their loyalty to Egypt and swear allegiance to him instead. During this time, the kingdom of Amurru, located at the northern edge of Egypt's sphere of influence, played a central role. Although Amurru's rulers were officially Egyptian vassals, many neighboring states accused its king, Aziru, of secretly supporting the Hittites. The Egyptians launched an investigation into these allegations, but ultimately cleared Aziru, decision that would prove to be a serious error. Not long afterward, Aziru formally allied himself with Suppiluliuma by signing a vassal treaty. In it, Suppilulium acknowledged, because Aziru submitted himself at my majesty's feet and abandoned Egypt's frontiers to do so, I, the great king, raised Aziru and placed him as king among his brothers. Suppiluliuma also placed a loyal client ruler in Kadesh, a key city just south of Amurru. Kadesh was a highly strategic location. It sat on the Orontes River, which flowed along the eastern edge of the mountain range that separated inland Syria from the Mediterranean coast. Controlling Kadesh meant controlling the only reliable inland north-south trade and military route through the region, by gaining influence over both Amurru and Kadesh. The Hittites significantly limited Egyptian power in northern Syria. Despite this, the Egyptians did not respond with force at least not immediately. During the reign of Tutankhamun, an Egyptian military expedition may have been sent against Kadesh, but it achieved little. Meanwhile, Egypt was facing internal upheaval. After the sudden death of Tutankhamun, his widow wrote to Suppiluliuma, requesting that he send one of his sons to become her husband. Though cautious, the Hittite king eventually agreed and sent a young prince. However, the prince was assassinated soon after arriving in Egypt. This act revealed deep political divisions in the Egyptian court, where some factions were clearly opposed to any alliance with the Hittites. Following this, Egypt's ruling dynasty Akhenatans line came to an end. power passed into the hands of high-ranking officials. Aya, a seasoned bureaucrat, took the throne and ruled for a few years, followed by the general Ramesses, who controlled Egypt for the next 2 decades. Meanwhile, Suppiluliuma sent one of his sons on a campaign in Syria to retaliate against Egypt and solidify Hittite control in the north. He strengthened his influence by placing royal family members as permanent representatives in key cities like Aleppo and Carchemish. However, not long after Suppilulium's death, a devastating plague swept through Hatti, claiming the life of his immediate successor. The next in line, Mercili II, was still quite young when he assumed the throne. According to his later annals. Other rulers initially dismissed him due to his age and inexperience. They said things like, "You're just a child who knows nothing. I have no respect for you. Your land is weakened. Your army and chariots are few. I have more troops and chariots than you do. Your father was strong, but you, a mere child, cannot." Compare during this period of perceived weakness. Client rulers across the region rebelled, including in central Syria. The king of Kadesh was among them. Mercili faced opposition not only from rebellious vassals, but also from rival powers like Assyria and Egypt, who encouraged the uprisings. Still, it took him 10 years, but he eventually re-established Hittite control across Syria, stretching from the Anatolian border to Kadesh. As a result, the northern territories that Egypt had once considered within its sphere of influence had now fallen under Hittite domination. Unsurprisingly, this shift displeased the Egyptian leadership. In 1292 BCE, Ramesses's former vizier, Ramesses I, founded a new dynasty. His family adopted the militant ideology of the long-deceased early rulers of Egypt's 18th dynasty. His son Seti I, who ruled from 1290 to 1279 BCE, launched campaigns into Palestine and then pushed northward into Kadesh and Amaru. He captured Kadesh and left a commemorative stele there, also claiming to have defeated a Hittite army in battle, though. This specific clash is not confirmed in other sources. These campaigns marked a renewed Egyptian attempt to roll back Hittite expansion in northern Syria. Alongside this northern push, Egypt also shifted its strategy in the south. Rather than maintaining loose diplomatic influence, the Egyptians began directly occupying southern Syria-Palestine. They established military outposts, administrative buildings, and other infrastructure to tighten their grip on the region. Egypt's political center was also relocated. After abandoning the city of Akhetanon during Tutankhamun's reign, the royal government moved to Memphis and began reviving older cities in the eastern Nile Delta. This process culminated under Ramesses II, who established a new capital in the eastern delta called Ramesses, meaning House of Ramesses. While Egypt was reasserting itself, the Hittites did not remain passive. Muwatalli II, who came to the throne in 1295 BCE following his father's reign, initially lost Kadesh and Amaru to Seti I. He also chose not to respond to Mitanni ruler Wasasha-Ta's plea for help against Assyrian aggression, likely because his focus was on preparing for renewed conflict with Egypt in a bold move. Muwatalli relocated the Hittite capital from the traditional royal center of Hattusa to a new city in southern Anatolia called Terhun Tasa, though the exact site of this city remains unknown. Although no record directly states how, it is clear that he succeeded in regaining control of Amaru and Kadesh. By the time Ramesses II came to power, the Hittite-Egyptian border had shifted back south of Amaru. Ramesses II, who had been groomed for kingship by his father, assumed the throne. At a young age, he would go on to rule Egypt for an extraordinary 67 years. From 1279 to 1213 BCE, Ramesses II continued the military campaigns initiated by his father in Syrio-Palestine. Advancing north along the coast, he reached the distant port cities of Tyre and Byblos. On his return journey, he turned inland and once again forced the king of Amaru to realign with Egypt. The following year, his fifth as pharaoh, he returned with a large army, this time aiming to secure control over the inland routes. This campaign led directly to his famous confrontation with the Hittites at Kadesh. The battle that followed is considered the most thoroughly documented military clash in ancient Near Eastern history, primarily because of the wealth of Egyptian sources, both written and visual, that describe it in great detail. For historians, this wealth of material poses a unique challenge. Was the battle itself truly exceptional, or is it only the surviving depictions that are... Ramesses employed many familiar themes and artistic conventions typical of Egyptian royal propaganda. However, the sheer amount of detail makes his account stand out. The question remains, are these descriptions a more elaborate version of a typical battle, or do they reflect something genuinely extraordinary? It's clear that Ramesses wasn't aiming to provide an objective or accurate report. His accounts glorify him as a heroic warrior and almost certainly distort the true outcome. In reality, he did not win the battle and may have been fortunate just to survive it. Most modern scholars regard the encounter as a conventional late Bronze Age battle, albeit on a larger scale than most. Others argue that it was an exceptional event that disrupted the usual military norms of the time. Unfortunately, we don't have a detailed Hittite version of the story. Their perspective is only briefly mentioned in a later treaty, where they stated, "Then my lord Muwatalli and the king of Egypt fought over the territory of Amaru. Muwatalli defeated him, overpowered Amaru by force, and brought it under his control." Ramesses, however, offered a much more dramatic version of the events. According to him, as the Egyptian army moved north, it was organized into 4 divisions, stretched out in a long column. Local informants claimed the Hittites were still far to the north, so the lead division made camp near Kadesh. In reality, the Hittite army was concealed behind the city and launched a surprise flank attack on the Egyptian camp while Ramesses himself was inside it, caught off guard. The Egyptian troops panicked. Ramesses claimed that he alone rallied and fought off the attackers, defeating them single-handedly. He even said the Hittite king sent him a message asking for peace, to which he graciously agreed. Modern scholars are skeptical of this version. Reliefs show that reinforcements arrived from the coast and played a key role. They also point out that the Hittites began looting the Egyptian camp prematurely before the battle, over-suggesting they believed they had already won. Most experts now believe the battle ended in a draw, with both sides exaggerating their achievements. While Ramesses' depiction of the battle follows the typical Egyptian trope of the lone heroic king triumphing against impossible odds, the scale of the event was exceptional. His army came dangerously close to total destruction, and only a mix of his personal leadership, timely reinforcements, and the Hittites' overconfidence saved the day. At least one historian has argued that the Battle of Kadesh was highly unusual for another reason. The Hittites broke traditional rules of warfare. Instead of issuing a formal challenge or launching a direct attack, they set an ambush and struck from the side. In doing so, they reversed the expected roles of attacker and defender, turning aggression into their form of defense. From this perspective, the battle marked a breakdown of the diplomatic and military norms that had governed conflicts in the region. The unraveling of the broader international system may have been even more significant than the battle itself. The clash at Kadesh was unusual because it was a direct confrontation between two major powers, Egypt and the Hittites, fighting each other openly on the battlefield. According to Ramesses II, the Hittite forces numbered 47,500 men, including 3,500 chariots and 37,000 infantry. The Egyptian army was likely of comparable size. These figures are probably exaggerated, but there's no doubt that both sides committed enormous resources, treating this conflict as a decisive moment in their long-standing rivalry over control of the Border, Leandus. Before Kadesh, many battles had taken place across the Syro-Palestinian region and beyond, but they were of a different kind. Typically, a major state's army would attack smaller local powers. These local kingdoms might receive backing from great powers, but the major states themselves rarely engaged each other directly. This doesn't mean their territories were never violated. Both Egypt and Hatti had conducted raids deep into Mitanni territory, but full-scale battles between superpowers were rare. Open-field battles were also uncommon. More often, fighting took the form of sieges, with armies surrounding fortified cities where defenders had retreated. At Kadesh, however, the Hittites didn't use the city as a defensive stronghold. Instead, they fought and defeated Ramesses in the open field. This may have been such a departure from the established norms of warfare that they couldn't, or chose not to, follow the usual diplomatic rules. Kadesh was a setback for Ramesses. It took him 2 years to recover and rebuild his position. He returned to Syrio-Palestine. His campaign focused on subduing rebellious southern states that had seized the opportunity created by his earlier defeat. By his 9th regnal year, he led an expedition that pushed far to the north, apparently without encountering Hittite resistance. This was likely because the Hittites were distracted by internal turmoil within their royal family and rising threats from the Assyrians in the east. Finally, in 1260 BCE, Ramesses II signed a peace treaty with the new Hittite king, Hattusili III, the brother of the late Muwatalli. The two leaders pledged to end their conflict and maintain peace. From that point on, both Kadesh and Amaro remained firmly under Hittite control. The Battle of Kadesh may have hinted at the collapse of the international system, but it wasn't the direct cause of its end. Nevertheless, within the next 100 to 150 years, nearly all the major states in the eastern Mediterranean would either vanish entirely or shrink dramatically in power, not due to conflict among themselves, but because of internal turmoil worsened by the arrival of new groups from outside the region. The end of any era is difficult to describe, often marked by chaos, and even harder to interpret. The decline of the Late Bronze Age has sparked over a century of scholarly debate. With conferences and books offering conflicting theories, some researchers see the changes as revolutionary and abrupt, while others emphasize long-term continuity and attribute the differences between the second and first millennia BCE to developments that happened well after 1200 BCE. What is clear is that many significant events occurred, though much of the detail remains murky. That's because, as cities collapsed, the written records they produced also disappeared. Here, I will outline some of the known facts, saving further interpretation for later discussion. By around 1250 BCE, the eastern Mediterranean appeared relatively stable and peaceful. The Mycenaean world had expanded to include parts of mainland Greece, the Aegean Islands, and parts of western Anatolia. The Hittites ruled over most of Anatolia and northern Syria west of the Euphrates River. Egypt held firm control over Nubia and Palestine. Assyria dominated northern Syria and Mesopotamia, stretching from the Euphrates in the west to the Zagros Mountains in the east. In Babylonia, a long-established Kassite dynasty was in power, while in nearby Elam, the royal family governed both the lowlands and highlands of the region. Though military conflict was always a possibility, generals were never short on ambition. The region had achieved a relatively balanced and stable geopolitical situation. A century later, that world had changed dramatically. Within another 100 years, it was gone entirely. So what happened? The Hittite kingdom, one of the best documented powers of the time and among those most severely affected, offers a useful case study. After the peace treaty with Egypt in 1260 BCE, the Hittites solidified their hold over northwestern Syria. By reaffirming their authority through renewed treaties with their client states, they fought a war against the island of Alatia, likely Cyprus, and brought it under their control. They also quelled unrest among their vassals in western Anatolia. While these external challenges were significant, the more serious problems came from within. Not long after the Battle of Kadesh, a dynastic dispute erupted within the Hittite royal family. This rivalry created lasting tension between two branches of the royal house, each rooted in a different region. When Muwatalli moved the capital from Hattusa to Tarhuntassa in the south, he established a second power center alongside the traditional one. Later, when Hattusili seized the throne, he returned to Hattusa and appointed his nephew Karanta to rule Tarhuntassa, giving him authority just below that of the crown prince. This arrangement effectively made the southern coast of Anatolia its own semi-independent political entity under a powerful client king. Hattusili's son, Tudaliya, later reaffirmed Karanta's status by signing a formal treaty engraved on a nearly 5-kilogram bronze tablet recently unearthed at Hattusa. But the uneasy power sharing didn't last. Karanta launched a coup, seizing Hattusa for a time until Tudalia recaptured it through military force. These internal upheavals may have continued to destabilize the Hittite kingdom, even as the last king, Suppiluliuma II, came to power in 1207 BCE. King Suppiluliuma II faced numerous difficulties during his reign. Some sources mention food shortages, while others suggest internal unrest within the Hittite heartland and growing instability among the kingdom's vassals. For instance, the king of Ugarit, a city on the northern Syrian coast, appeared to have opened diplomatic channels with both Assyria and Egypt, signs that central authority was weakening. Archaeological evidence shows that several major Hittite cities were destroyed or abandoned, though some remained intact. The capital, Hattusa, was completely deserted. Fires broke out in the royal citadel and other official buildings, signaling either internal conflict or organized attack. According to one Egyptian account, invading sea peoples overran the Hittite kingdom, however. Modern historians are skeptical of this claim. The destruction was not uniform, it varied by region and appears to have been selective. For example, Carchemish, a key city on the Euphrates, survived and later became the center of a new dynasty that upheld many Hittite traditions for generations. A similar pattern played out in the Mycenaean world. Texts from that time offered little help in understanding the turmoil, but archaeology reveals a patchwork of outcomes. Major fortified centers like Mycenae and Tiryns were destroyed, others were abandoned, and some like Argosor remained inhabited. Although under harsher conditions, the decline didn't happen overnight. For decades before 1200 BCE, the Mycenaeans had been strengthening their defenses, likely in response to growing threats. Destruction occurred at different times and locations, not as part of a single coordinated collapse. There's also evidence that people from the Mycenaean world migrated eastward, including to Cyprus. Several Cypriot settlements were destroyed during this period, but some scholars argue that power on the island became more centralized around large coastal cities, leading to a kind of flourishing that lasted for about another century. In northern Syria, some of the Hittites' client states fared far worse. Ugarit, a major center of trade and diplomacy, was violently destroyed around 1200 BCE and never recovered. Yet nearby cities such as Byblos remained standing. In southern Syria and the Palestine region, people adopted new material cultures, relocated into hill country, or withdrew into lowland towns. These shifts are usually associated with the arrival of new groups, including the people later known as the Philistines, rulers of city-states along the Mediterranean coast at the same time. Egypt's grip over its Palestinian territories weakened significantly. With control largely limited to some areas near the Red Sea and the Sinai, Pharaoh's Merneptah reigned 1213 to 1204 BCE and Ramesses 311-87 to 1156 BCE both claim to have fought off invasions by Libyan forces and the so-called Sea Peoples, a loose confederation of foreign groups. In 1180 BCE, Ramesses III described how these Sea Peoples had already destroyed various kingdoms in Anatolia, such as Hatti, Tarhuntasa, and Arzawa, northern Syria, like Carchemish, and Cyprus-Alatia, before amassing in western Syria and launching an attack on Egypt by both land and sea. His account is dramatic, but ultimately unreliable. We now know that Carchemish and Alatia were not destroyed. Furthermore, the Sea Peoples he named had already been mentioned in earlier Egyptian records, sometimes even serving as mercenaries, including during the time of the Battle of Kadesh. Ramesses III presented their invasion as a sudden crisis. But even he referenced similar events a few years earlier. Merneptah had described comparable troubles almost 30 years before that. While historians offer different explanations for these inconsistencies, the Egyptian records simply cannot be trusted as accurate historical sources in this case. It's clear that Egypt went through a period of major upheaval during the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, after the death of Pharaoh Merneptah, who ruled from 1213 to 1204 BCE. Political infighting at the royal court led to a usurpation of the throne. At one point, a royal butler held real political control. This chaos may have led to civil war. It took the rise of a new ruling house, the 20th dynasty, to restore some order. All but the first pharaoh of this new dynasty took the name Ramesses, trying to evoke the glory of the famous Ramesses II, however. After Ramesses III, these kings achieved little: political unrest, economic decline, and the breakdown of law. An order led to Egypt's weakening both at home and abroad. Asterisk, by around 1080 BCE. Egypt had fragmented into 3 separate political regions. A later story from this era tells of a priest from Thebes named Wenamun who traveled to the Levant to buy wood. There, he found a world entirely different from the one Egyptian envoys would have encountered 2 centuries earlier. The local rulers no longer treated Egypt with deference. The Prince of Byblus, for example, mocked Wenamun's request for wood as a religious gift for the god Amen and demanded payment in advance. Byblus was no longer an obedient client of Egypt. It had become an independent trading partner. While the eastern Mediterranean fell into turmoil, regions farther east experienced a different kind of collapse. The easternmost major city to fall suddenly was Imar on the Euphrates, which was destroyed soon after 1187 BCE. Beyond that point, the collapse of political systems came more from internal conflict and warfare between rival states. In Assyria, the assassination of King Tukulti-Ninurta I in 1207 BCE ended the kingdom's aggressive military expansion. The administrative outposts that Assyria had established in northern Syria remained, but they became far less active. For the next 300 years, the historical record of Assyria is sparse. There simply aren't enough surviving texts to give a clear picture of what happened. Babylonia remained relatively stable until the middle of the 12th century, when kings from Elam to the east launched repeated invasions. These invasions eventually toppled the Kassite dynasty, which had ruled Babylon for centuries. In 1155 BCE, the Kassite kings were replaced by a new dynasty, likely based in the southern city of Isin. Archaeological evidence suggests the region went into economic decline during this time. Still, Babylonia saw a resurgence in the late 12th century under King Nebuchadnezzar I 1125 to 1104 BCE, who led a campaign to destroy Elam as revenge for its earlier attacks. Elam had been one of the last great powers of the late Bronze Age to rise, and it was the last to fall, although it had enjoyed military success in Babylonia around 1155 BCE. These were raids rather than lasting conquests. 30 years later, Elam's last king was defeated by Nebuchadnezzar in a battle at the river Karun and forced to flee. The Babylonians looted the Elamite capital of Susa, and the Elamite ruler likely retreated to the eastern part of his realm. He was unable to recover, and by around 1100 BCE, Elam, like all its neighbors, had entered a period of silence, so deep that we know almost nothing about its history afterward. Asterisk. The collapse of the long-standing system in the eastern Mediterranean didn't happen overnight, but the changes it brought were profound. The powerful states that had once dominated the region either vanished or became significantly weaker. Economic activity plummeted. As a result, there were no major construction projects to leave lasting monuments. No royal scribes produced written records for future generations to read. Urban life diminished dramatically. Many people moved into small villages or adopted a more nomadic lifestyle, following herds of animals. New groups began to gain influence. Some had lived in the region all along but had previously lacked power, while others were newcomers. These included the Libyans in Egypt, the Arameans in Syria and Mesopotamia, the Persians in western Iran, the Philistines and Israelites in Palestine, and others. By the time historical records begin to reappear in the 10th century BCE, the eastern Mediterranean world had been reshaped. New people filled the vacuum left by the fallen empires. New technologies became common, like ironworking and alphabetic writing. Societies had changed, and new cultural traditions replaced the old ones. The world of the first millennium BCE was entirely different from what came before. Asterisk. Historians often concentrate on individuals who played roles within state structures, the central figures in the narratives we construct. This focus makes sense, as these individuals generated most of the written and archaeological records we rely on. They lived in towns and villages and depended on local farmers for sustenance. However, we must not overlook the many others who existed on the edges of this world, people who did not write or leave behind grand monuments. These peripheral populations lived both beyond and within the borders of the states we study. Beyond the frontier, distant groups interacted occasionally with the people of the Eastern Mediterranean. At the same time, within these states lived individuals who did not conform to the social norms of the text-producing elites. Although often viewed as outsiders or outcasts, they regularly engaged with the main figures of the time, foreigners and social outcasts. Frequently overlapped and shared lifestyles distinct from those in settled urban and rural communities. 2. The writers of historical texts, they were the other seen, but not fully understood. Still, these marginalized groups played an active role in shaping the history of the region. To ignore them would be a serious oversight. Even though they are difficult to study, it is essential that historians attempt to understand them, in many ways. The outside world had no real boundaries, and goods traveled astonishing distances. Spices like cinnamon and pepper from Southeast Asia made their way to Egypt. Lapis lazuli mined in Afghanistan was highly prized by elites throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. We cannot determine precisely how far these goods traveled, how long the journeys took, or how many intermediaries were involved. In the 3rd millennium BCE, traders from the Indus Valley reached Babylonian ports, although later evidence is sparse. The technology to make such voyages was still available in the late 2nd millennium. It's possible that people from the Near East ventured into the Indian Ocean, though no clear evidence confirms this. Meanwhile, inhabitants of Syrian coastal cities and Greece, renowned for their maritime expertise in the early 1st millennium, likely had the ability to reach the Western Mediterranean even earlier. In the late 2nd millennium, artifacts left behind show that Mycenaean sailors visited places like Italy and Mediterranean islands such as Sicily. None of the highly literate civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean left us detailed accounts of journeys to far-off places. The closest example we have is the written and visual record of an expedition sponsored by Queen Hatshepsut to a place known as Punt, believed to have been located somewhere along the Red Sea coast of East Africa. The Egyptians portrayed Punt as a mysterious and foreign land, populated by people with unfamiliar appearances, living in a strange natural setting and unusual houses. Punt held a sense of fascination and wonder for the Egyptians. An earlier Egyptian story, considered one of the earliest pieces of travel fiction, offers another glimpse into this fascination with distant lands. The story of the shipwrecked sailor, known from a single manuscript dating to the early 2nd millennium BCE, tells of a sailor who, while traveling down the Red Sea, ends up on an island inhabited by a giant talking snake. The snake recounts the tragic tale of its family's death caused by a falling star and predicts that the sailor will return home in 2 months, implying a journey of great distance. Still, these faraway contacts are not the focus here. Instead, the concern lies with the more immediate periphery. The Eastern Mediterranean was surrounded by regions where life differed greatly from that of the central. Urbanized states, due largely to environmental conditions, in the deserts surrounding Egypt and those between Mesopotamia and Syrio-Palestine, as well as in the mountainous areas of Iran, eastern Anatolia, Transjordan, and northern Greece, permanent year-round settlements were difficult to sustain. In many cases, only small communities could exist, and the urban lifestyle familiar to the core regions was simply not possible. But these peripheral zones weren't only outside state borders. Within each state, there were also areas where agriculture and settlement were limited. In some places, there wasn't enough rainfall. The soil was poor, or the terrain made irrigation with canals impossible. These regions varied widely and included hills, steppes, and deserts. Despite the challenges, these areas were not empty. They were home to communities that maintained important, though often complex and uneasy, relationships with the rulers and urban populations at the heart of the states. These interactions between core and periphery were essential to the region's history. Although difficult to study, they're crucial for understanding the broader dynamics of the ancient Eastern Mediterranean world and should not be overlooked. Asterisk, asterisk. One group from the late Bronze Age that clearly illustrates the complex ties between the core states and their surrounding margins was known as the Habiru. It's also spelled Habiru or Abiru, though scholars continued to debate the correct form. The origin of the word suggests meanings like one who has left his home, implying a refugee, exile, or migrant. Scribes often wrote the name using the Sumerian or Babylonian terms for murderer or thief, indicating how these people were viewed. Although the term Habiru had existed for a long time, it was during the latter part of the 2nd millennium BCE that the group became especially significant in the Syro-Palestinian region. Mentions of the Habiru can be found in cuneiform records across the Near East, in the Levant, at places like Kumadu, Kubret, Alalik, and in cities that contributed to the Amarna letters. In Anatolia, at Hattusa, in northern Mesopotamia, at Nuzi, and in the southern Mesopotamian cities of Nippur and Babylon. The Egyptians also used the term in their hieroglyphic inscriptions. Who exactly were the Habiru? In the 19th century, many scholars believed the name referred to an ethnic group related to the Hebrews. That theory has since been largely dismissed. Today, most scholars view the Habiru as a broad category used for people who had become detached from their original tribal or urban communities. They are often seen as a third force, neither fully settled nor fully nomadic. Asterisk, asterisk, in both tribal and urban contexts. Individuals or small groups could leave their communities for various reasons: poverty, criminal activity, or political exile. This kind of departure wasn't limited to the lower classes, it even happened among elites. One notable example is Igrimi, a prince from Aleppo, who tells of abandoning his home and living among the Habiru for 7 years. He recounts, "I took my horse, my chariot, and my servant, and set out for the desert. I joined the Sutian warriors and spent the night with them. The next day, I continued on to the land of Canaan, staying in the town of Amia. People from Aleppo, Mukish, Naya, and Amay were living there. When they discovered I was the son of their former ruler, they gathered around me. I lived among the Habiru for 7 years. This story reflects how even individuals of high status could become part of the loosely defined world of the Habiru. Afterward, Igrimi sought support from the king of Mitanni, who appointed him as ruler of Alalak. It's worth emphasizing that Igrimi made a conscious choice to live among the Habiru. He wasn't born into that group. Likewise, his return to urban society was his own decision. Many fugitives found refuge among Habiru communities. Once part of these groups, sources describe them as adopting a few defining traits. They were often seen as aggressive and uncontrollable. This reputation is especially evident in the Amarna letters. In one letter to the Egyptian king, Assyrian, Mayer reported, "The Habiru captured Gilunu, a city belonging to the king, my lord. They looted it, set it on fire, and barely a single household survived." This kind of negative portrayal shouldn't surprise us. Throughout Mediterranean and world literature, people living on the margins of society have typically been depicted as dangerous or immoral. Over time, the names given to such groups remained remarkably consistent. Where 2nd millennium BCE writers referred to Habiru as refugees, S.A.Gaz as murderers, or Habatu as thieves. Later authors in the 2nd millennium CE used words like Foricidi, Banditi, and Ladroterms, meaning outlaws, bandits, or thieves. In all cases, they were seen as social misfits or outsiders. Despite this negative image, the relationship between settled societies and the Habiru was not entirely hostile. In fact, the Habiru were often valued as ideal candidates for mercenary work. Throughout history, displaced people have made effective soldiers because their loyalty typically lies with their employers rather than with any family, tribe, city, or nation. As a result, Habiru were incorporated into the armies of Syro-Palestinian states, and among the Hittites, the term came to be broadly associated with mercenaries. They even had a patron deity. The Egyptians also made use of the Habiru, particularly in Nubia. 2 letters discovered in Kumadu in present-day Lebanon show the Egyptian king requesting his local governors in Damascus and Shazina to send me the Habiru, about whom I wrote earlier. I plan to resettle them in the cities of the land of Cush Nubia, to take the place of those I have deported. This reveals how the Habiru were not only feared and distrusted, but also actively recruited and relocated as a useful labor and military force within the state system. In the competitive political landscape of Syro-Palestine, many states sought to use the Habiru to their advantage. These displaced groups were organized and turned against the very rulers they had once served or fled from. Rabahata of Byblos, for example, repeatedly complained to the Egyptian king that Abdi-Ashirta of Amaru was using the Habiru against him. He wrote that the Habiru and chariots have been stationed at the gate of Byblos and have not moved, and warned that all the king's lands up to Egypt's borders will fall to the Habiru. He even reported that all the Habiru have been gathered together to attack me. It appears that nearly every army in the Syro-Palestinian region made use of Habiru fighters. Military rosters from Alalak list large numbers of them. One record mentions 1,436 soldiers, including 80 charioteers. In letters to the Egyptian overlord, local rulers often reported that their Habiru troops were doing well, indicating that these fighters held a distinct and valued place within their forces. However, the Habiru were not the only such group. They were part of a much broader array of marginalized or peripheral peoples mentioned in late Bronze Age texts. To the authors of these texts, all such groups were treated in much the same way. They were portrayed as fundamentally different, even opposite, to the settled and civilized world the writers represented. These outsiders were viewed not only as strangers, but as the negation of the author's own identities. This raises important questions. What can we truly learn about these people? To what extent was the image presented by the texts accurate, or simply a reflection of elite biases and fears? The outer and inner edges of the Eastern Mediterranean states shared one key trait. Regardless of their diverse environments, they couldn't sustain a settled lifestyle. These regions became home to the second major part of the agricultural economy's pastoralism. They served as grazing grounds for large flocks of sheep and goats, as well as herds of cattle, which were raised throughout the area. Pastoral life across the region was shaped by transhumance,
the seasonal migration of livestock between summer
and winter pastures. Brodel identified two types of transhumance, which he called normal and inverse. In the normal pattern, people from the lowlands would move their animals up into the mountains during the summer. Since lowland fields were needed for growing crops, this migration was driven by the need for open space. In contrast, inverse transhumance occurred when people from the highlands descended into the lowlands during winter to escape the cold. These migrations also allowed them to reach markets, where they could trade their goods for items they couldn't produce themselves. When describing these movements, Brodel focused mainly on the European peninsulas and the Mediterranean. In both types of transhumance, the animals were kept away from farmland and orchards during the summer, which worked well for farmers. It meant their crops could grow undisturbed and be harvested without interference from livestock. However, in the Eastern Mediterranean, the situation was more complicated. The typical pattern of herders moving into the mountains during summer for better grazing did occur in areas like Greece, Crete, various islands, Anatolia, the hills of Syro-Palestine, and the Zagros Mountains. But more often, transhumance went in the opposite direction. Herders traveled between deserts or steppes and the fertile lands near rivers, in places like the Syrian desert, the Negev, the deserts around Egypt, and the Mesopotamian steppe pastures. Were available in winter, away from farmland, but not in summer. As a result, herds would move into river valleys during the peak agricultural season when crops were ripe and ready to harvest. This often led to conflicts between farmers and herders. Governments tried to regulate the herders' movements, had little power over them in winter, when the herds were too far away. In Egypt, these tensions were less severe. There, the herds typically arrived after the harvest was already finished. Transhumance was not a random or aimless movement. It followed well-established routes. These routes could stretch for hundreds of kilometers, though they typically didn't exceed around 200 kilometers. Because these paths were consistent and predictable, states were able to set up checkpoints to monitor the movement of herders, and, if necessary, block their passage. One remarkable example of such control comes from an Egyptian documental letter from a border official during the reign of Merneptah. In it, the official reports, "We have just finished allowing the Shosu tribes of Edom to pass through the fortress of Merneptah Joyous-in-Truth, located in Jeku, so they could reach the water pools of Ptolemy, also in Jeku, in order to keep themselves and their cattle alive." This letter shows that herders from Edom, in Transjordan, were granted access to the Nile Delta to feed their livestock. However, interpreting this document is difficult. It's the only one of its kind, so we don't know whether the situation it describes was part of a regular migration pattern or an exceptional case. If it was common, it would imply an annual journey of over 300 kilometers from the highlands of Transjordan through the Sinai to the Nile Delta. This route began outside Egypt's direct control at that time, making it a significant and long migration. But if this event was unusual, the document simply records a rare occurrence, offering little value for understanding general patterns of transhumance. While routes can be reconstructed for some historical periods, this is not possible. In our case, we can only speculate that ancient paths may have resembled those used in more recent times. But there is no certainty. Modern scholars often rely not on ancient texts, but on ethnographic studies of present-day pastoralists living in areas once inhabited by ancient nomads. By observing current transhumance practices, they try to understand how similar migrations may have worked in the past. However, this method has its risks. It assumes that pastoral practices have remained mostly unchanged over time, and that the environments have stayed the same. Many researchers have challenged this assumption, arguing that today's practices may not reflect those of ancient or prehistoric societies. For example, the idea of moving herds between seasonal pastures only applies when dealing with large herds. Smaller groups of animals could often survive on local resources, especially with stall feeding. Also, areas that are now used as highland grazing grounds were often heavily forested in the past, making them unsuitable for anything but the smallest herds. Additionally, the social and economic relationships between farmers and herders may have shifted significantly over time. These criticisms pose serious challenges for historians. While we might assume that the general way of life for pastoralists has persisted over time, we have very little insight into the specific details of how it actually functioned in the distant past. Historians who study the Eastern Mediterranean often use terms like pastoral nomads or semi-nomads to describe herding communities. These terms can be misleading, as they evoke images of later nomads traveling with camels or horses groups that became significant in the region's later history. The term semi-nomad is especially confusing because it implies a transitional phase between full nomadism and permanent settlement. But semi-nomadism was not a stepping stone. It was a stable, long-standing way of life that endured for thousands of years and still persists today. Despite modern governments' efforts to force these communities into settled lifestyles, for this reason, I prefer the simpler term nomads. A key feature of their way of life was their existence between two worlds, both inside and outside of state control. Governments often tried to assert authority over them, usually through military force. Yet these efforts were generally ineffective, as the environments where pastoralists lived were not well suited to conventional warfare, just as sedentary lifestyles varied greatly depending on the local ecology and the types of agriculture practiced. So too did non-sedentary ones. In the late 2nd millennium BCE, for example, nomads did not yet travel long distances with camels. Instead, they moved with herds of cattle, sheep, and goats. In addition to the previously discussed variations in transhumance patterns, there were also differences in how permanent or clearly defined the grazing territories were. Many pastoralist communities had strong ties to settled communities, often as part of the same extended group. Others ranged much farther, living in temporary camps and moving across either wide or limited areas. Unfortunately, Our surviving texts don't give enough detail to distinguish clearly between these different types of groups. As a result, we are often left to study all of them under a single general label. Historians have a limited understanding of pastoralist societies, which poses a significant challenge. These groups left behind no written records, and their presence is difficult to trace through archaeology. As a result, we are forced to view them through the lens of settled communities that often held negative views of them. In nearly every ancient culture, nomads were seen as the ultimate outsiders. To the settled, civilized peoples who produced the texts we rely on, the nomadic way of life symbolized primitiveness and a lack of refinement. This creates a precarious situation for historians of the Near East, while in classical Greece, we sometimes find ethnographic-style descriptions of nomads, albeit shaped by Greek agendas in the Near Eastern sources. We must piece together fragmented glimpses drawn from a variety of texts. These include literary works, personal letters, and royal inscriptions. Any picture of pastoralist life that emerges from this material is inevitably shaped by the modern scholar's own assumptions about ancient nomadism. During the 1960s, historians moved away from the older idea of desert nomads, repeatedly invading agricultural lands in waves such as the Amorites, Arameans, or Arabs. In its place came a model that viewed nomadism as a stage in a gradual process of settlement, often involving poor and hostile groups. This theory, too, was eventually challenged and gave way to what has become the more widely accepted view today. Rather than seeing nomads and farmers as enemies or rivals, current scholarship emphasizes their interdependence. Instead of conflict, there was often cooperation between the two. The farmer and the herder each represented a different part of the agricultural economy. Ideally, they lived in a symbiotic relationship. The farmer produced crops and had access to goods that pastoralists lacked, while the herdsman provided essential animal products: milk, meat, wool, hides, intestines, and bones. In a well-functioning system of seasonal migration, livestock grazed fallow fields during winter, fertilizing the soil and promoting plant growth by trimming young shoots. In summer, with the animals moved elsewhere, farmers could safely harvest and store their crops without interference. But this cooperative vision rarely appears in the written sources, whether from the region and period under discussion or from other times and places. Instead, nomads are often depicted in starkly negative terms: uncivilized, violent, and threatening. The persistent hostility found in these accounts is striking, and it raises important questions. Are modern scholars perhaps idealizing the relationship between farmers and pastoralists more than the historical reality supports? So how were pastoral nomads actually portrayed in ancient sources? One of the first things that stands out is the vague and inconsistent use of names. Many different names have been recorded: Lumu, Kutu, Sutu, Habiru, Shosu, Mage, and others. At first glance, these seem to refer to distinct ethnic groups, tribes, or alliances. But when scholars have gathered and analyzed the evidence, they've often found that these labels were used loosely. Rather than identifying specific well-defined groups, the names often pointed to a general way of life at the same time. The terms used to describe nomadic groups in specific regions changed over time. In northern Syria, for example, different names appear in succession during the late 2nd millennium BC, first the Sutians, then the Alamu, and later the Arameans. These likely referred to a range of tribal groups who used the same pastoral routes through the area. The shifting terminology suggests that the authors of these texts recognized changes and distinctions over time, at least to some degree. It's possible that some nomadic groups were clearly defined in the early stages of their history, but that their names later became generic or even derogatory labels. For instance, the Sutians may have been a specific group in northern Syria during the early 2nd millennium, but over time, their name was used more broadly to describe pastoral nomads in general. This generalized use could even cross linguistic and cultural boundaries, such as when the Hittites used the term Sutian to describe the Gazga, nomads from northern Anatolia who were completely unrelated to the original Sutians of Syria. This confusion reflects a deeper ideological view that nomadic peoples existed outside the flow of history. From the perspective of settled societies, time seemed not to move for the nomads. A name that originally described a people living in the Zagros mountains in the 3rd millennium BCE, like the Guchans, was still being used by 1st millennium Babylonians to refer to entirely different groups, such as the Persians. Yet this doesn't explain everything. There was often a certain ambiguity in how these names were used. Sometimes they referred to specific groups. Other times they simply described a nomadic lifestyle, because we can't always tell which meaning was intended. We must be cautious when compiling references to a particular name across different time periods, regions, and types of sources. Otherwise, we risk mixing data that carried very different meanings in their original context. The writers of ancient texts reveal very little real understanding of nomadic peoples beyond the use of their names. Perhaps the most striking aspect of how settled societies in the ancient Near East viewed nomads was their deep sense of otherness. These non-sedentary groups were seen as outsiders people, fundamentally different and difficult to understand. One unique example of this perspective appears in the Egyptian tale of Sinna. Although it dates to the early 2nd millennium BC, earlier than the period we're mainly discussing, it stands out as one of the only extended depictions of life among pastoral nomads, and so it cannot be overlooked. The story goes like this. Sinna, a high-ranking court official under King Amenhotep, I flees Egypt upon hearing of the king's death, apparently afraid of Crown Prince Senwosret, who is away fighting in Libya. As he escapes, he crosses the Nile and passes the walls of the prince, a defensive barrier built to keep out the Asiatics and desert wanderers, that is, the nomads. He eventually reaches Palestine, where he nearly dies of thirst, but is saved by a nomadic chief, a man who had been in Egypt. Sinna finds refuge with the tribe of Amenanchi, a leader of upper retinue. Amenanchi, whose name is West-Semitic and Amorite in origin, respects Egypt and the new pharaoh, Senwosret. He welcomes Sinna, even allowing him to marry his daughter and choose where he wants to settle. Sinna describes his new home in glowing terms. It is a beautiful and fertile place called Ya, rich with cultivated figs, grapes, and more wine than water. There are olive trees, abundant honey, and a wide variety of fruits. The land also grows barley and emmer wheat and is full of livestock. Sinna receives generous daily rations, including wine, cooked meat, roast fowl, and desert game hunted. For him, meals are prepared with milk and sweetened delicacies, and his hunting dogs bring in fresh catches. He lives there for many years, raising sons who grow up to lead their own tribes. Sinna earns fame as a warrior, ultimately proving himself by defeating a rival tribal champion in single combat. His victory secures his status, wealth, and reputation as a successful tribal leader. Yet despite his achievements, Sinna longs to return to Egypt, to live near his king, and receive a proper burial. Senwosret grants his request, welcomes him back into the court, restores his former rank, and arranges for him to live in the palace and be buried in a pyramid. The tale of Sinna is carefully structured to emphasize Sinu's identity as an Egyptian courtier. His life begins and ends within the Egyptian court, creating a narrative frame that highlights his time in Palestine as an unusual and temporary departure from the norm. This contrast is reinforced by his crossing of a distinct boundary, the walls of the prince, which mark the separation between Egypt and Asia. The world he enters beyond that wall is clearly portrayed as non-sedentary. There are no towns or cities. Sinna lives in a tent, and wealth is measured in livestock, both his own and that of his enemies. Society is organized by tribes. However, this portrayal does not offer an accurate depiction of nomadic life. The luxurious lifestyle Sinna describes in Palestine mirrors that of a wealthy landowner in Egypt. Abundant fruit trees and grain, plentiful livestock, regular servings of meat from hunting, and even daily rations, something that aligns far more with life at the Egyptian court than with that of a pastoral nomad. The author of the story wanted to show that Sinna had thrived abroad, which would make his desire to return home a more powerful statement about the superiority of Egyptian life. But the only way the author could express success was through the familiar lens of a comfortable, sedentary lifestyle. Because of this, the tale is of little value today for understanding the actual conditions of non-sedentary life in Syria-Palestine. The Tale of Sinna stands out for its unusually positive depiction of nomads as honorary Egyptians, so to speak. In most other Eastern Mediterranean sources, nomadic peoples are consistently portrayed as bandits and thieves. Writers not only saw their lifestyle as incompatible with culture, but often depicted nomads as barely human. One Egyptian text from the Late Bronze Age vividly illustrates this view, describing the Shosu hiding in narrow valleys and portraying them as monstrous in size and appearance, supposedly standing up to 2.5 or 3.5 meters tall and having grim, unwelcoming faces. This portrayal is clearly a stereotype, reducing nomads to savage, almost mythical beings. Across ancient Near Eastern texts, the dominant trait assigned to nomads is ferocity. Nearly every recorded interaction between nomadic groups and states is framed in military terms. Nomads are almost always cast as enemies or targets of military campaigns. There is only one notable exception to this pattern. Nomads could be recruited as mercenaries. But even this reinforces the stereotype that violence was the only skill they truly possessed. Such ideas are not unique to the ancient Near East. They reflect a widespread pattern in many cultures. Settled peoples, those of cities and farmlands, tend to hold deep suspicions and even contempt for those living in mountains, steppes, or deserts. This creates a stark contrast. On the one hand, ancient texts consistently depict nomads as wild, dangerous, and uncivilized. On the other, modern scholars often emphasize the valuable economic role pastoralists played in their symbiotic relationship with settled agricultural communities. The divide between these two perspectives is too sharp to dismiss as simple prejudice on the part of ancient writers. There may be deeper reasons behind this enduring tension between how nomads were perceived and the reality of their contributions. **1. Of the main reasons for the contradiction between ancient and modern views of nomads lies in how broadly the term nomad is used. We're forced to group together a wide range of people under this single label, even though their ways of life, relationships with settled societies, and motivations could differ greatly. The ancient texts don't clearly distinguish between pastoralist communities living on the edges of state territories and criminal bands that, like in any peasant society, preyed on organized settlements under state control. There were many different kinds of nomadic groups, and their interactions with states varied widely. While there was often economic complementarity between farmers and herders, that didn't always translate into peaceful, mutually beneficial relationships. Interactions between the two could take many forms, and a key factor in shaping those relationships was competition over resources. In regions where herders brought their animals into agricultural areas during the summer rite, when crops were ripening, tensions with farmers were likely high. In contrast, when herders moved into the highlands during summer, away from farmland, conflict would have been much less common, at a deeper level. Pastoralists and farmers had fundamentally different attitudes toward the environment. Aimed to preserve the land by moving on once local resources were exhausted. Whereas farmers sought to improve and permanently settle the land they worked, the sources we have also tend to lump together very different types of groups. For example, texts describe both outsiders trying to force their way into state territory like the Libyans in Egypt, and nomads resisting state interference in their own lands, like those in northern Syria opposing Assyrian control in the same hostile terms. Much of the hostility expressed in these sources may reflect resistance to state domination rather than acts of aggression by nomads. Anyone who defied the state was often branded as a rebel or a bandita label that grouped together many different people with varied motives. Still, we should not entirely ignore the element of violence in nomadic behavior. Nomads didn't always apply the same moral restraints toward outsiders as they did within their own social groups, and their treatment of settled people could be harsh. Whether this stems from the nature of tribal societies where revenge and feuding are integral to social life, says some scholars argue, is uncertain. But we cannot dismiss the fact that nomads were sometimes capable of extreme cruelty. The same applies to social bandits outlaws, from settled societies who often showed no mercy when confronting state authorities. For these reasons, we must be careful not to idealize or romanticize nomadic life. While they played a crucial role in the broader economic and social landscape, their behaviors, like those of any group, included both cooperation and conflict, peace and violence. Who were these nomads? Many different peoples lived on the edges of late Bronze Age states, and their relationships with those states varied in complex ways. Unfortunately, the sources available to us are often biased and overwhelmingly negative, making it difficult to separate historical reality from prejudice. These sources also tend to lump all nomadic groups, both those inside and outside state borders, into a single category, which can be misleading. A brief look at how different states interacted with nomads helps illustrate the challenges we face in understanding them. Let's begin with Egypt. During the New Kingdom period, Egypt extended along the Nile Valley for more than 2,000 kilometers. But its influence beyond the river valley was limited. Most of the land surrounding Egypt could not support permanent settlement. To the west lay the vast Sahara Desert, of which only a narrow northern strip was suitable for pastoral nomadism. Along the Mediterranean coast of North Africa lived a variety of tribal groups collectively referred to by the Egyptians as the Jemhu. During this period, two groups appear to have been particularly prominent: the Libu, or Libyans, and the Meshwesh. Though several other tribes also inhabited the western desert, these tribes likely centered their activities in the region of Cyrenaica, about 700 kilometers west of the Nile Delta, where there was enough vegetation to sustain their herds. A narrow, relatively fertile coastal strip allowed them to travel eastward toward Egypt. It's likely that a pattern of seasonal migration into the Nile Delta had existed for centuries, generally under Egyptian supervision. However, by the 13th century BCE, this arrangement appears to have shifted. The Egyptians began to view the western tribes as a growing threat. In response, Ramesses II built a series of fortresses along the western boundary of the delta from Memphis to the sea end, along at least 300 kilometers of the Libyan coast. These fortifications seemed designed to monitor and restrict the movements of these nomadic groups. Later, Pharaoh Merneptah described in great detail how he repelled a coalition of Libyan tribes and northern invaders known as the Sea Peoples during the 5th year of his reign. In both inscriptions and imagery, he portrayed the Libyans as fierce warriors attempting to invade Egypt and credited his own leadership with stopping them. Not long afterward, Ramesses III claimed to have faced the same challenge. He boasted of having twice defeated similar alliances of Libyans and Sea Peoples. In quick succession, these accounts reveal how interactions between Egypt and its nomadic neighbors were often cast in militaristic, adversarial terms, though whether this reflected actual, constant conflict or the pharaoh's need to project strength is harder to determine. Interpreting the accounts of these Egyptian kings presents several challenges. Was the pressure from the Libyans in the 13th century BCE truly greater than before? If so, what caused it? Were they being pushed eastward by other groups? Did they suffer from famine? If famine was a factor, what triggered it? It's also possible that internal social changes among Libyan tribes led them to seek more permanent settlements, something only the Nile Delta could provide. Alternatively, rising competition over shared grazing zones between groups with different lifestyles may have spilled over into Egyptian territory. Another possibility is that there was no major change at all, just a shift in Egyptian policy. Perhaps the Egyptian state suddenly decided to block what had been a routine pattern of seasonal migration into the delta. The Egyptians may have described relatively minor military actions as though they were full-scale conflicts between equal states, simply because the language of military narrative tended to frame events in that way. Whatever the cause, the 13th century clearly marked a turning point. Libyan groups did eventually enter Egypt and became a significant political force in the western Nile Delta and beyond. In fact, some dynasties that rose to power after the collapse of the New Kingdom were descended from Libyan mercenaries who had settled in the region. but it's still unclear whether this rise to power was the result of their military service to the Egyptian state or the outcome of an invasion. We simply don't have enough evidence to say. In the south, Egypt's interactions with nomadic groups were different. The sources mention many names for regions in southern Nubia inhabited by nomads such as Miu, Iram, Gorsas, Turek, Wirish, and Tarawa. Egyptian control only extended as far south as the Fourth Cataract, and these groups likely lived beyond that point. The Egyptians had no need or ability for direct control, but they did collect tribute from these southern peoples. This tribute included rare goods from Central Africa that the Egyptians could not obtain otherwise. From time to time, Egyptian military expeditions were launched to ensure the flow of these payments. Interestingly, there is no evidence that these southern nomads attempted to move northward into Egypt. However, after the New Kingdom ended, they became the foundation of a powerful new state, one that eventually conquered southern Sudan. Whether this state-building process was influenced by earlier Egyptian contact or developed independently remains an open question. In the eastern desert, the nomadic people known as the Mejay had a long and complex relationship with Egypt. From the early 2nd millennium BCE, they caused occasional problems, moving across the region from just below the First Cataract up to perhaps even lower. Egypt, they often raided Egyptian gold mining expeditions and transport routes. Yet the Mejay were not only a threat, they were also valuable allies. Even before the New Kingdom, they had been recruited into Egypt's military as specialized troops. During the New Kingdom period, they served as police, guarding cemeteries and maintaining order across the country. Their leaders held prestigious positions. One example is the Theban tomb of Nebamon, a captain of police, which is richly decorated and even includes a scene of his Mejay troops paying homage to him. Clearly, the Mejay could not only integrate into the Egyptian system, but also rise within it and achieve honor and influence. Finally, the Egyptians also encountered nomadic groups in the Syro-Palestinian region, which they had brought under their control. The terrain there was very different from that of Egypt, and so were the relationships between settled populations and nomadic groups. Unlike the Libyans or the Mejay, who generally lived outside Egyptian-controlled areas, many of the Syro-Palestinian nomads resided right in the heart of the conquered lands at that time. Much of the hill country in the region was still covered with dense forests and thick underbrush. The best way to describe the environment is with the French term maquis, sturdy shrubs growing from rocky soil. It's often taller than a person. Clearing such vegetation was extremely difficult with the tools available during the Bronze Age. Only the lower parts of the hills offered limited grazing and small patches of arable land, making this landscape perfect for pastoral nomads and nearly impossible for regular armies to control. Groups like the Habiru moved through this rugged zone and posed a serious military challenge to the Egyptians during their initial conquest of the area, just as formidable as the fortified cities. Pharaoh Amenhotep II claimed to have captured 36,000 Habiru. Though this figure is likely exaggerated, the Habiru were not the only group to trouble the Egyptians in Syro-Palestine. Another group, the Suteans, were similarly disliked but sometimes served in local armies. In the hills of Transjordan, the Shosu may have been more concentrated. Egyptian texts mention the Shosu frequently throughout the New Kingdom. They were active in the Negev, Palestine, and Syria, probably more as raiders than as traditional herders. As previously noted, they were also allowed to graze their herds in the eastern Nile Delta, though this was done under Egyptian supervision. Different groups occupied different regions and had varied relationships with Egypt. But certain patterns repeat. These nomadic peoples were often outside direct state control, yet they maintained regular contact with the Egyptian state. The written records mainly highlight military encounters and surprising given their official, state-centered perspective. But these confrontations were likely the exception, not the norm. This pattern wasn't unique to Egypt. Across the eastern Mediterranean, similar dynamics played out. In Mesopotamia, particularly in Assyria and Babylonia, the most prominent nomadic group of the period was known as the Alamu. Later, the name Arameans appears, and while we can't clearly distinguish between the two, they seem to have been closely related. Both groups followed similar transhumance practices and had comparable relationships with nearby states. By the early 1st millennium BCE, the Arameans had become a major political force, dominating a vast region from western Syria all the way to the Persian Gulf. They are a powerful example of how nomadic groups could transition into settled societies, get control of cities, and rise to political prominence. During this time, many of the small states in Syria were controlled by Aramean rulers. The Assyrians had to deal with Aramean pressure on their borders, and in Babylonia, the Arameans had become one of the most influential population groups. If they were indeed the same people or closely linked to the Alamu, then their presence in the region had deep historical roots rather than being a recent arrival. We generally associate the Alamu and Arameans with northern Syria, where Assyrian records first mention encountering them during military campaigns. For example, Shalmaneser, who ruled from 1273 to 1244 BCE, reported that Shatura, king of Hanigalbat, joined forces with the Hittites and the Alamu to seize mountain passes and block Assyrian access to water sources.
Long after Hattusili,
3 of Hatti wrote a sharp letter to the Babylonian king Kadashman-Enlil, criticizing him for failing to control the Alamu, who were interfering with communications between the two empires. It's possible that the fall of the Mitanni state had allowed the Alamu greater freedom of movement in northern Syria. However, evidence suggests their presence was not confined to that region. A century earlier, they were already active much farther away in Dilmun, modern-day Bahrain, in the Persian Gulf. Letters from the reign of the Babylonian king Bernaburish, 1357 to 1333 BCE, complain about their disruptive behavior there. One reads, "The Alamu have taken all the dates, there's nothing I can do." Another laments, "They speak to me only of violence and plunder, never of peace. I was ordered to negotiate, but they refused to listen. Still, we must be cautious not to read too much into the specific names used in these sources. The term Alamu may have functioned as a general label for nomadic groups. To complicate matters further, the term Sutian common in Syro-Palestinian texts also appears in Mesopotamian records and often seems interchangeable with Alamu. Over time, relations between settled Mesopotamian societies and these nomadic groups grew increasingly hostile. By the late 12th century BCE, the Mesopotamian states were largely on the defensive and began to lose control over vast parts of their territories. The Arameans pushed deep into Assyria, even forcing King Tiglath-Pileser I 1114 to 1076 BCE to abandon his capital and retreat into the mountains. Earlier, during the reign of Adad-Abdillah 1168 to 1147 BCE, Aramean raiders had attacked cities in Babylonia and looted religious temples, carrying off sacred statues. Interestingly, it was the Assyrians who eventually recovered and returned these cult objects to the Babylonians, suggesting a temporary alliance between the two major powers in response to the threat posed by the nomads. Despite such efforts, the nomads proved impossible to contain. The rise of Aramean political dominance in the 1st millennium BCE is a clear sign of their eventual success in infiltrating and reshaping the landscape of the settled world. The Assyrians didn't only come into contact with nomadic groups in the west, they also encountered them in the mountainous regions to the east and north. Names like Kutu, Lalumu, and Shubaru appear frequently among their enemies, though these terms were likely used broadly and without much precision to describe mountain tribes. Kutu was an archaic label originally used for the Gudians of the 3rd millennium BCE. Lulumu was also an old name, appearing in sources from the latter half of the 2nd millennium in areas stretching from northern Syria to the eastern banks of the Tigris. Shubaru, meanwhile, simply meant northerner. It's clear that the Assyrians wanted to control these mountain peoples, but their actual success is debatable. Despite repeated campaigns, the tribal alliances of Euroatri and Neri in eastern Anatolia effectively resisted Assyrian influence. In fact, during the early 1st millennium BCE, these groups unified to form the kingdom of Urartu, which would become one of Assyria's most powerful rivals. These examples drawn from the states with the most extensive written records highlight the typical pattern of how nomads were portrayed in official texts. They were seen as hostile outsiders who had to be conquered. Various groups were often lumped together with no acknowledgement of their differences, and they were never spoken of positively. State records focused solely on military engagements and always claimed victory over the nomads. Yet, political reality of the first millennium BCE across the region tells a different story. The nomads were far from being subdued. They not only endured, but also rose to power, becoming significant players in the political landscape. Asterisk in the sources from the late Bronze Age. The image of the nomad is overwhelmingly negative and remarkably consistent. The author's urban sedentary people from the late 2nd millennium BC tended to lump all nomadic groups together. Whether they lived within or beyond state borders, they portrayed them as violent, unreliable, and a threat to the safety of the countryside. As a result, state authorities often viewed nomads as military enemies and sought to suppress them. Yet, at the same time, these same states regularly recruited nomads as mercenaries. Taking advantage of their martial abilities when it suited their needs, these settled writers displayed little understanding of the nomadic way of life. They failed to recognize the economic interdependence that modern scholars often highlight between pastoral nomads and agricultural communities. While today we understand that these groups could complement one another economically, that perspective was largely absent from ancient, state-centered sources. This harsh and dismissive view of nomads stands in stark contrast to how people in the first millennium BCE remembered the past. Later generations, reflecting on their origins, often identified themselves as descending from nomads. Rather than seeing nomadism as the opposite of civilization, they considered it a simpler, earlier way of life, something they had outgrown as they developed more complex societies. This idea is reflected in two major literary traditions from the Eastern Mediterranean that later shaped the Western worldview. Classical authors, from Homer through Roman historians, describe the early migrants into Greece as the founders of their civilization, which replaced the earlier Mycenaean culture. Thucydides, for instance, openly stated that the ancient population of Greece was nomadic in origin. The land now known as Hellas had no stable population in ancient times. Instead, it saw constant migrations as various groups under pressure from stronger invaders were always ready to abandon their territories. This perspective marks a shift from fear and scorn toward a recognition of nomadic heritage. Even if it was framed as something primitive and left behind, during the classical period, the Greeks took pride in their distinct ethnic identities such as Dorians, Ionians, and Achaeans. Even after settling in cities, they continued to identify themselves by tribal affiliations. They organized their civic populations into units called phylae, which roughly translates as tribes. Early modern scholars took these accounts at face value, using them to try and reconstruct a complex history of migrations across the Aegean world. However, many scholars today view that effort as futile. The sources are too scattered and often contradictory. As a result, many now believe that the tribal divisions used by urban Greeks were a later invention, dating from around the 6th century BCE. The Hebrew Bible offers a similar account, claiming that the ancestors of the Israelites and Judahites were pastoral nomads who lived on the edges of urban society. According to the biblical story, famine drove them to Egypt, where they lived for generations before eventually returning in large numbers to conquer Canaan. There they established a new political order based on a confederation of 12 tribes, each controlling its own territory and cities. Over time, this tribal system evolved into a monarchy. The Bible suggests that this development from tribe to kingdom occurred not only in Israel, but also in nearby regions like Edom and Moab. Throughout their history, the people of Israel and Judah continued to see tribal identity as central to who they were, even after becoming fully urbanized. Just as with classical Greek traditions, scholars have shifted from reading these biblical stories as literal history to viewing them critically. Many now question the historical accuracy of the patriarchs' nomadic origins, the conquest of Canaan, and the ancient roots of Israel's tribal divisions. Scholars of both classical and biblical traditions continue to debate how much of these ancient origin stories we should accept as historical fact and how much we should dismiss. The academic literature on the topic is enormous, and I won't try to resolve those debates here. What matters for our discussion is that, at a certain point in their histories, the authors of both the Greek and biblical traditions traced their origins back to tribal societies that had migrated into and taken over the lands they lived in. These authors also emphasized that tribal identities still mattered in their own times. Greeks, Israelites, and Judeans all shared the idea that tribes eventually evolved into states. For them, this transformation marked a shift from savagery to civilization. Thucydides, for instance, believed that the so-called barbarians of his day lived much like the early Greeks once had. To the Greeks, settling down and building cities was a sign of progress. This idea deeply influenced modern thinkers as well. Lewis Henry Morgan, one of the founders of modern theories of social evolution in the 19th century, had read both Greek texts and the Hebrew Bible. He studied the development of Greek society and referenced the 12 tribes of Israel, helping to reinforce the ancient narrative that states emerged from tribes. So, when we challenge the old stories told by the Greeks and Israelites, we also challenge the foundations of modern evolutionary thinking about how societies form, even though the ancient sources are often biased and confused when it comes to nomadic peoples. Some things are clear. Non-sedentary groups were present throughout the eastern Mediterranean in the late 2nd millennium BCE, and they played a significant role in the region. Yet the authors of the time almost universally portrayed them with contempt. That view stands in stark contrast to how people in the 1st millennium BCE thought. Many of them believed their ancestors had come from nomadic backgrounds, and, like the Bible says, they might have proudly claimed, "My father was a wandering Aramean." **** In 1349 BCE, during the 5th year of his reign, the Egyptian king, Akhenaten, founded a new city to serve as his royal capital. He named it Akhenaten, meaning horizon of the sun disk, in honor of the god Aten, whose worship he promoted above all other deities in Egypt. While Akhenaten's religious reforms are fascinating and have been widely studied, they are not the focus here. What matters for our purposes is the act of founding new cities like Akhenaten. Akhenaten wasn't unique in doing this throughout the late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean. Rulers established new cities for themselves and their courts. This widespread practice reveals a great deal about the political and social dynamics of the time. King Akhenaten portrayed the founding of Akhenaten as a deeply personal act, inspired directly by his god Aton, to mark the city's boundaries. He had 14 large stelae carved into the cliffs around the Nile Valley, extending from the eastern mountains to the western desert. Each stele showed the king, his wife Nefertiti, and 2 of their daughters standing beside an inscription explaining how and why he created the city. No official ever advised me to do this, or did anyone in the land suggest it or present me with a plan for building Akhenaten in this remote place. It was the sun disk, my father, who instructed me to create it for him. The city's territory covered around 16 by 13 kilometers. On the west bank of the Nile was a large agricultural area, likely filled with villages and farms, where workers and their families lived. The main city, modern-day Tel El Amarna, sat on the east bank. It stretched for 6 kilometers and housed government buildings and residential quarters for Akhenaten's court and staff. Construction lasted just 12 years and ended with Akhenaten's death in his 17th year on the throne, 1336 BCE. But during that short time, builders managed to complete several palaces, administrative offices, and temples, many built in stone. These structures were decorated with painted reliefs, filled with altars to Aten, and adorned with colossal statues of the royal family. The homes of courtiers were built as spacious villas with formal reception rooms, private living areas, and storage spaces. The full scale of the construction effort is unknown and probably never will be, but it must have been immense. For more than a decade, Akhenaten was one vast construction site, filled with architects, laborers, sculptors, and painters, all working tirelessly to bring the king's vision to life. Akhenaten was designed to function like a large, self-sustaining estate. The farmland on the opposite side of the Nile was capable of feeding a population of 45,000. While it's likely that the city's elite owned farms elsewhere in Egypt to boost their income, and that the royal administration redirected some imperial resources to the city, the local harvests were ideally meant to support Akhenaten's food supply. In the boundary stele, Akhenaten described the city as a complete, self-contained world. Everything within these four stele, from the eastern mountain of Akhenaten to the western mountain, is Akhenaten in full. It belongs to my father, Haraten, life-giver, for all eternity. It includes hills, uplands, marshes, newly cultivated lands, fields, water, towns, riverbanks, people, herds, groves, everything my father Aden causes to exist forever and continually. While Akhenaten was still under construction, it also served as the functioning capital of Egypt's vast empire. Akhenaten and his court had left the traditional seats of power, Thebes and Memphis, to rule from this new city. At its center stood the king's house, the building where Akhenaten conducted the business of governance and met with his officials. Close by were the administrative offices of various government departments, although most were destroyed after the city was abandoned. One office, however, has left behind especially valuable evidence, known as the Bureau of the Correspondence of Pharaoh. It housed the king's diplomatic archives, now famously known as the Amarna letters. These clay tablets, written in Babylonian cuneiform, preserved communications between Akhenaten and foreign rulers and vassals. While the king may not have read the tablets himself, he was likely briefed on their content and consulted on the replies. In addition to diplomacy, many other matters of state were handled in the heart of the city, where Akhenaten regularly met with his advisors. The city of Akhenaten served as the stage for Akhenaten's carefully choreographed performance as king. By relocating to a site halfway between Egypt's traditional power centers, Memphis to the north, where the Nile meets the delta, and Thebes to the south, the religious heartland of the god Amun, Akhenaten distanced himself from the general population. He surrounded himself with a hand-picked inner circle, yet even from them he maintained a physical separation. His royal residence, positioned along the river in the northern part of the city, was heavily fortified. When he needed to meet with his officials, he would ride his chariot down the royal road, likely lined with loyal subjects expected to honor his passage. His actual interactions with people took place only at the king's house, and even their access to him was tightly controlled and steeped in ritual. Unusually for the period. We have visual depictions of Akhenaten engaging with his subjects. In these images, he appears at the window of appearances, much like Queen Elizabeth greeting her people from Buckingham Palace's balcony. These scenes show him handing out rewards to grateful courtiers. Akhenaten was presented as the sole source of wealth and privilege in a highly centralized palace system. Everything flowed from him. The mediator between the god Aten and his people. Every part of Akhenaten reinforced this vision of kingship. Since Akhenaten was unique in Egyptian history for worshipping only one god, Aten, the city's temples were dedicated exclusively to that deity. As with other Egyptian temples, they were entered through grand gates, but unlike the dark and closed spaces typical of most sanctuaries, Aten's temples were open to the sky. Because Aten represented the sun disk, his worship took place in sunlit courtyards. A smaller chapel within the city was even dedicated to the worship of the king himself. To fully replace Thebes as the religious and political capital, Akhenaten moved the burial grounds as well. He intended for both his family and high officials to be interred in the mountains east of the city. While the officials' tombs were carved not far from where they lived, the royal tombs were located deep in the eastern cliffs, about 11 kilometers away and difficult to reach. However, the work proved too ambitious for Akhenaten's short-lived existence. Only Akhenaten's own tomb was nearly finished. The burial places for his relatives and many of his officials remained incomplete when the city was abandoned. Akhenaten's city was short-lived and didn't outlive its founder by much. Soon after his death, traditional priests and officials who had been pushed aside during his reign regained their influence. They compelled the young king Tutankhamun to move the royal court back to Memphis. Khatanum wasn't abandoned right away. Some residents remained for a while, but their numbers gradually dwindled, and the city became a ghost town. About 60 years later, when Ramesses II came to power, his massive building campaigns sealed the city's fate. Akhenaten became a convenient quarry for his construction projects at Hermopolis, just 20 kilometers to the northwest. Ramesses' builders dismantled the city, repurposing its finely carved and painted stone blocks as construction material. Ironically, this helped preserve many of the city's colorful reliefs, which survived because they were reused as foundations. Today, it's difficult to imagine the full grandeur of Akhenaten, and only the foundations of its palaces and temples remain. But even those give us a sense of the city's impressive scale and the extraordinary effort behind its rapid construction. To build such a city in just 12 years, Akhenaten must have mobilized the resources of his entire empire. He was certainly not a weak or powerless ruler. Later generations of Egyptians rejected him. They erased his name from records and destroyed many of his monuments. Modern scholars have often viewed Akhenaten as an eccentric outlier, so unusual that he doesn't seem to fit into the broader history of Egypt or the ancient Mediterranean. In terms of his religious beliefs, that may be true. But in other ways, he was entirely typical of his time. The city he built and the political and social order it represented had clear parallels across the eastern Mediterranean world of the late Bronze Age. Building a new capital has always been a powerful political move from ancient times to today. In the modern world, leaders who undertake such projects are often seen as authoritarian. For example, President Nursultan Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan faced criticism for relocating his country's capital. Such a decision disrupts the lives of government officials, pulling them away from their homes and families. It also creates logistical challenges for foreign diplomats, who must find new housing, hire staff, and adapt to a new location. The costs are immense. In 1998, Kazakhstan spent more than $500 million to build its new capital, Astana. Throughout the long history of the ancient Mediterranean, several rulers established new capitals, but interestingly, relatively few did so before the era of Alexander the Great and his successors. When a king did take such a step, it was a significant event, remembered for generations, sometimes even as a stain on their legacy. In Mesopotamia, the great Sargon of the 24th century BCE was celebrated for his accomplishments for over 1,000 years, yet his decision to found a new capital, Agada, eventually came to symbolize arrogance and overreach. That makes it all the more notable that during the 14th and 13th centuries BCE, several rulers across the eastern Mediterranean created new capital cities. Most of these rulers even named their cities after themselves, something earlier kings rarely dared to do. We know of such new capitals in Elam, Babylonia, Assyria. There may have been others as well, but these are the ones that have been uncovered through archaeology, though not all are equally well studied. Despite the differences in excavation, the cities share many characteristics. The second ruler known to have founded a new capital city was Akhenaten of Egypt, reigned 1353 to 1336 BCE, whose case has just been discussed in detail. His city, however, was unusual in that it wasn't named after him, but after his favored god. While religious devotion may have driven Akhenaten's decision, the project required significant political authority and ambition, and its effects were far-reaching. Sometime before Akhenaten, the Babylonian king Kurigalzu moved the royal court from the ancient city of Babylon to a new city named after himself, Dur-Kurigalzu, meaning Fortress of Kurigalzu. The ruins of this city stretch along a 2-kilometer area near the Akarkuf Depression, a low-lying basin that channels overflow from the Euphrates River. Only a small part of the city has been excavated. The most prominent surviving structure is the core of a ziggurat or temple tower, which still stands near modern-day Baghdad. Nearby, archaeologists have identified a religious complex with at least 4 temples, along with a large palace area. Su served as the royal residence for over a century, till later kings eventually moved back to Babylon in the 13th century BCE. 3 powerful rulers in the eastern Mediterranean also founded new capitals named after themselves, abandoning older centers of power. The Assyrian king Tukulti-Ninurta, i.e., ruled 1243 to 1207 BCE, established Kartakulti-Ninurta harbor of Tukulti-Ninurta just 3 kilometers north of the ancient capital, Assur. Perched on the floodplain across the Tigris River, the new city rose in a place where no prior settlement had existed. Though its full size remains uncertain, the city stretched at least 3 kilometers along the river. At its heart was a walled inner city covering 60 hectares, which contained 2 palaces, a ziggurat, a temple dedicated to the god Ashur. Inscriptions found at the site quote Tukulti-Ninurta as saying he founded the city at Assur's request. Then the god, Assur. My lord asked me to establish a cult center across from my city, the one chosen by the gods, and he commanded me to build his sanctuary. So, by his command, I built before my city, Assur, a city for the god Assur, across the Tigris, in fields and meadows where no house had stood, no ruins had formed, and no bricks had ever been laid. I named it Kartakulti-Ninurta. Like other such projects, the city's fate was tied closely to its founder. When Tukulti-Ninurta was assassinated in his later years, the city lost its political importance. Subsequent kings returned to Azor. Kartakulti-Ninurta became a relatively minor city within the Assyrian realm. Around the same time, Kayulam, built of Elam, built Al-Antashna-Parisha, or city of Antashna-Parisha, as is new. Capital about 35 kilometers south of the traditional center at Susa, while the full extent of the city is unclear. It included a walled inner zone of about 100 hectares. In the northeast, at a palace complex, while at the center of the city, rose a massive ziggurat surrounded by many shrines. Thousands of inscribed bricks found in the temple tower record Antashna-Parish as the builder. The inscriptions suggest that he built temples for about 25 different gods, leading many scholars to believe that the city was meant to celebrate the unification of Elam, bringing together religious traditions from both the highlands of Anshan and the lowlands of Susa. The main ziggurat, for instance, was dedicated to Naparisha of Anshan and Inshushianik of Susa. Yet, like the other royal capitals of this period, the project was left unfinished. Construction stopped after the king's death, following a gap in our historical records. Later, Elamite rulers returned to Susa. The final example of a newly built capital also comes from Egypt and may have been the most ambitious of them. Ramesses II, who ruled from 1274 to 1213 BCE, created his royal residence, Ramesses meaning House of Ramesses in the eastern Nile Delta. The city sprawled across an area of about 1,000 hectares. One historian, perhaps a bit too enthusiastically, once called it probably the vastest and most costly royal residence ever erected by the hand of man. Because of its immense scale, Ramesses absorbed older cities, including Avaris, the former capital of the Hyksos rulers from 3 centuries earlier. Its size and location spread out over fertile farmland and lower Egypt make it impossible to fully reconstruct the city's layout, so archaeological work has focused on specific areas. These excavations have revealed numerous temples, palaces, stables, and workshops. Ramesses was clearly an impressive sight, and ancient Egyptian texts speak of it with awe and admiration. I have arrived at Ramesses' beloved of Amun and found it in excellent condition. It is a district like no other, modeled after Thebes. Re himself founded it. The residence is delightful to live in its countryside, abounds in every good thing, and it is well provisioned each day. Its ponds are full of fish, its pools teeming. With birds, its granaries overflow with barley and emmer. Its ships sail out and return, bringing food and supplies each day. Joy lives there, and no one says, "I wish I had something more," despite its splendor. Ramesses may have served more as a religious and ceremonial center than as the actual seat of government. That role likely remained with Memphis, where the kings were buried. This may help explain why, not long after Ramesses II's death, Ramesses began to decline in political importance. The nearby city of Tanis eventually took over many of its functions. Ramesses continued to exist until the 8th century BCE, when parts of it were dismantled. Looking at these 5 cities from the 14th and 13th centuries BCE, we find some striking similarities. They were all enormous, built quickly and strongly, tied to the identity of their founders, who often named the cities after themselves or in one case after a personal deity. The cities were frequently described as having been built on untouched land, emphasizing their fresh start rather than being extensions of existing settlements. Each one featured a central district with temples and palaces, forming the heart of the royal and religious presence. Asterisk, however, none of these cities proved to be lasting political capitals. Most of them lost their importance or were abandoned soon after their founder's death, revealing how closely their fate was tied to the ruler who had envisioned them. The very existence of the new capital cities, founded during the late Bronze Age, reveals a great deal about the power wielded by Nemoka. Kings at that time? These construction projects were so vast that they must have drawn on the full resources of the state. Throughout history still today, rulers have used grand building works to showcase their authority and immortalize their names. In fact, 4 of the 5 kings we've discussed embedded their names directly into the names of the cities they founded. Clearly, they had no intention of these capitals being short-lived. Each of them ruled in lands with cities that had stood for centuries, and they likely hoped their new creations would enjoy a similar longevity. These cities also offer insights into the nature of kingship in the period. We should be cautious not to view kingship in the ancient Near East as a fixed and uniform institution across all cultures and times. Our understanding is especially influenced by Egyptian sources, which are by far the most abundant. Even within Egypt, however, kingship evolved and faced challenges during the New Kingdom. Despite this, certain fundamental traits of kingship remained constant and were shared across much of the Eastern Mediterranean world. The new capitals give us a glimpse into how these traits were expressed. Urban historians have long noted that a city's layout reflects the worldview of those who design it. When building a new city or even a new neighborhood, planners have more freedom to express their ideals as they are not constrained by existing structures. Except for Ramesses, all of the capitals discussed here were deliberately built on empty land. As Tukultina Nerdai put it, they were established where no house or dwelling had stood. These blank landscapes gave rulers complete control over the city's layout and symbolism. The kings took full advantage of that opportunity. Their cities were carefully planned to express and reinforce the ideology of kingship. Among them, Akatan stands out because it is the best documented. Both in its overall design and in the details of daily life, it gives us the clearest window into how a king's vision could be made physical, how the layout of a capital could serve as a political and religious message in stone. On the east bank of the Nile, the city of Akatan was laid out in a long ribbon of official buildings that followed the river, all connected by a grand royal road about 30 meters wide. Temples and palaces stood side by side, and the city was designed to honor both the god Aten and the king, reflecting a deliberate blending of religious and royal authority. The city's layout was meant to emphasize the deep connection between the two. Akatan was organized along a north-south axis, following the path of the royal road. The king's world was divided into 4 zones, each separated by ramps or gates: a residential zone in the north, a sacred zone, a secular administrative zone, and a recreational zone in the south. The king's palace, located at the northern edge of the city along the river, was his private residence. When he moved southward, he passed through the ceremonial palaces and the great temple of Aten in the sacred zone. At the heart of the city stood the king's house, the administrative center with nearby offices. Finally, in the south, temples, surrounded by gardens and pools, offered spaces for rest and relaxation. This planned progression through the city paralleled the movement of the sun across the sky, Just as the sun rose in the east, the king emerged from his northern palace. Midday, when the sun reached its peak, corresponded to the king's appearance in the king's house, where he would address his people from the window of appearances. Like the sun, the king was seen as a source of light, prosperity, and order, driving away darkness and chaos. As the sun set, both God and king withdrew, taking their beneficent powers with them. In this way, Akhenaten was not just a city, it symbolized the cosmos itself. Akhenaten may have taken the fusion of God and king to an unusual extreme, but the core idea behind it was deeply rooted in Egyptian kingship. The king was not just the god's representative, he was considered the son of the sun god. For example, Hatshepsut, a female pharaoh, worked hard to promote the story of her divine birth, claiming that Amun-Re had visited her mother in the form of Thutmose, the first to conceive her. Egyptian kings were believed to become gods after death, and some like Amenhotep III and Ramesses II Evan had cults dedicated to them during their lifetimes. While the degree to which living kings were regarded as divine is still debated, the close connection between king and god is undeniable, and Akhenaten made that connection visible and tangible like no other place in Egypt. The other new capital, cities of the late Bronze Age, reflected the same fundamental idea as Akhenaten, the close connection between king and god. In each of them, temples and palaces were placed in the heart of the city, reinforcing the symbolic and practical bond between divine power and royal authority. While the nature of that relationship varied across cultures and changed over time, the underlying concept was shared. Egypt gives us the richest documentation for this idea. But we do have evidence from elsewhere. In Assyria, for instance, a text from the reign of Tukulti-Ninurta I describes his coronation ritual. As the king entered the temple, the high priest of the god Ashur declared, "Ashur is king! Ashur is king!"
House.
This proclamation meant that the god became king at the same moment the human ruler took power, and it was on behalf of the god that the mortal king ruled. Yet the king was not just an ordinary person. Assyrian rulers like Tukulti-Ninurta adopted titles such as sun god of the land. While they were not literally gods, they were considered far closer to the divine than any other human. The title sun, or sun god, was widely used by powerful rulers of the time. Vassals in Syria, for example, regularly addressed the pharaoh of Egypt as "my son," the sun from the sky. In one letter, Abimelku, the king of Tyre, described the Egyptian king in exalted terms. "My lord is the sun, rising over the lands each day." Following the destiny of the sun, his gracious father, who gives life with his sweet breath and returns, with his north wind, who holds the whole earth in peace by the power of his arm. In doing so, Abimelku reflected the Egyptian belief that the pharaoh was the son of the sun god, or even the sun god incarnate. Similarly, the Hittite kings adopted the title "my son," especially during the second half of the second millennium. Despite the different religions and deities in Egypt, Assyria, and the Hittite world, all three cultures gave the sun god a central role, a pattern echoed in many other ancient civilizations. One of the sun god's most important duties was the preservation of cosmic order. Egyptian texts illustrate this vividly. In their view, darkness allowed chaos to roam, while sunrise restored peace and order. A hymn to Aten, the sun disk god, describes this vividly. "When you are in the western light land, earth is in darkness, in the condition of death. The sleepers are in their chambers, heads covered. One eye does not see the other. If they were robbed of the goods beneath their heads, they would not know it. Every lion leaves its den. All the serpents bite. Darkness is a grave. Earth is silent until the Creator returns to the land of light." In this view, the sun was not just a celestial body, it was the force that kept the world from falling into chaos. And in the ideology of kingship across the region, the king mirrored the sun, bringing light, order, and life to the land. The situation completely changed once the sun rose and brought light back to the world. Like the Egyptians, the Babylonians believed that the sun had a positive life-giving force. In hymns to the sun god Shamash, they praised him for ensuring justice and safety, reflecting a widespread belief across ancient cultures in the sun's power to sustain order. For the Egyptians and, for many others, the universe was governed by two opposing forces, order and chaos. It was the responsibility of both gods and humans to defend order. The Egyptians had a word for this concept, Mahat. Mahat was a complex idea encompassing justice, truth, proper social behavior, and even Egypt's supremacy over other nations. Order was never taken for granted. It was fragile and constantly threatened, symbolized by the image of a delicate feather. Although everyone was expected to support Mahat, it was the king's duty above all to uphold it. As the most powerful and divinely connected human, only the king had the authority and tools to fully enforce it.
Ow.
Every new reign was seen as a renewal of creation, a time when chaos was once again pushed back and order restored heaven. If Egypt had been stable for years, it's why many new kingdom pharaohs opened their reigns with declarations that they had defeated chaos. Regardless of whether actual conflict had occurred, during Akhenaten's rule, the concept of Maat evolved. It became closely tied to the sun god Aten, reflecting the unique religious ideas of the time. But even outside this unusual period, Mahat and the sun god were always linked in Egyptian thought. The king's responsibilities, whether leading campaigns abroad or managing justice at home, were understood as earthly reflections of what the sun god did in the heavens. This principle wasn't exclusive to Egypt. In Assyria, the king was also seen as responsible for maintaining cosmic order, mirroring the sun god's daily journey across the sky, which banished darkness and upheld stability. Founding a new city. In this worldview was more than just a political or logistical act. It was a symbolic moment of creating order from chaos. Akhenaten is especially significant in this regard. Under Akhenaten's ideology, Maat was seen as a universal force, and the city's construction reflected that belief. But the idea extended beyond Egypt, across the eastern Mediterranean. Cities were seen as islands of order surrounded by a dangerous and chaotic countryside. The physical presence of fortified walls served not only to protect residents from external threats, but also to symbolize the triumph of order over the disorder of the wilderness. In essence, founding a city was akin to recreating the world anew, a small-scale version of the original act of creation itself. There are many ways to explore the concept of kingship in the Eastern Mediterranean during the late 2nd millennium BCE. The topic is far too complex to cover fully here. However, one striking trend from this period, the founding of at least 5 new capital cities within a relatively short time, offers a unique insight into the ambitions of certain kings. In several states, rulers pushed the limits of their power by building entirely new capitals, often naming them after themselves and filling them with grand temples and palaces. These cities served to reinforce the king's divine role and his close association with the gods, who were seen as the guarantors of order in the world. In creating these new capitals, kings deliberately turned away from older, traditional centers of power, places that for centuries had been the heart of religious and political life. These new cities, sometimes called disabeted capitals, had no pre-existing institutional or social foundation. Establishing them required not only a vast redirection of resources, but also a reshuffling of political hierarchies. Long established, elite families in cities like Ashur, Babylon, Susa, Memphis, and Thebes, families who had traditionally supplied the priests and top officials, found themselves displaced or replaced by newcomers. This disruption was especially clear in the case of Akhenaten. His reforms went further than most, marginalizing the old religious and bureaucratic establishment. While his actions were unusually radical, it would be a mistake to assume that other kings' initiatives met no resistance. It's likely that, in every case, powerful groups resented the king's efforts to shift the balance of power. These rulers didn't just want to strengthen their position. They aimed to fundamentally rewrite the structure of authority. But these grand ambitions did not always last. The capitals founded by Akhenaten and Tukulti-Ninurta lost their significance soon after their founders died. Akhenaten's religious revolution was quickly undone. and later Egyptians came to view his reign as a time when cosmic and social order had been lost. As for Tukulti-Ninurta, he was eventually assassinated. Although his death is not directly linked to the creation of his capital, Tukulti-Ninurta, it seems clear that he lost the support of his people. Toward the end of his life, he grew increasingly suspicious of those around him. In one psalm to the gods, he gave voice to his fears. All the evildoers await a dark day without sunshine. Their threatening fingers are stretched out to scatter the armies of Assur. Vilely they plot evil against their benefactor. These words suggest a king who felt betrayed and isolated, a powerful reminder that even the most ambitious rulers could not always impose their vision without consequences. There are many ways to explore the idea of kingship in the Eastern Mediterranean during the late 2nd millennium BCE, and the topic is far too complex to fully cover here. However, the sudden appearance of at least 5 newly founded capital cities during this time reveals something significant about the ambitions of certain kings. In several regions, rulers pushed their pursuit of absolute power to the extreme. By building cities named after themselves and filling them with temples and palaces, they sought to tie their own identities more closely to the gods and to the divine role of maintaining cosmic order. These kings turned away from long-established capitals that had, for centuries, symbolized the traditional connection between kingship and the gods. Instead, they created what scholars call disembedded capitals, entirely new cities, with no previous institutional or social foundations. In practical terms, these new cities demanded the redirection of massive resources that otherwise would have gone to older centers. Ideologically, they disrupted the prestige and influence of the traditional elites. Prominent families in cities like Ashur, Babylon, Susa, Memphis, and Thebes, families who had long provided priests and high officials, were pushed aside or replaced by newcomers. This shift was especially apparent in the case of Akhenaten, whose reforms clearly marginalized the old religious and bureaucratic class, though his actions may have been unusually radical. It's unlikely that other rulers' efforts to reshape power dynamics were welcomed by the established elites either. These kings seem to have deliberately challenged the status quo and sought to restructure the existing order, but the fate of these new cities shows that royal power was not as all-powerful as their founders may have imagined. Akhenaten's capital and the city of Tukulti-Ninurta quickly lost their importance after the king's deaths. Akhenaten's reforms were reversed. The Egyptians came to view his reign as a time when Matatha, ideal of cosmic and social order, had been broken. Tukulti-Ninurta was eventually assassinated. Though historical sources don't directly link this to his founding of Tukulti-Ninurta, still there are signs that his people grew disillusioned with him, and near the end of his life he may have become paranoid. In a psalm addressed to the gods, he confided his fears. All the evildoers await a dark day without sunshine. Their threatening fingers are stretched out to scatter the armies of Assur. Vilely they plot evil against their benefactor. Other newly founded capitals on to Shensu perished. Dur-Kurigalzu and Ramesses lasted longer, but they never truly replaced the traditional political centers. Over time, Susa, Babylon, Memphis, and Thebes once again dominated, overshadowing these newer cities. This pattern shows that royal authority, while powerful, was not absolute. Kings relied on support, but not from the general population. Their power rested instead on a narrow elite, one that shared many features across the different societies of the Late Bronze Age. Asterisk. When Untashnaparisha and other kings moved their courts to newly built capitals, they intentionally disrupted the existing balance of power in their kingdoms. These moves were driven by self-interest acts in which the king and a hand-picked group of courtiers abandoned established cities that had long been political centers, relocating instead to remote, uninhabited areas for those who had once had easy access to the court. This sudden shift made reaching the king much more difficult. The court became isolated, retreating into its own separate world. These relocations reflected a model of kingship that valued seclusion and separation from the general population, not a ruler who stayed connected with his people. Building new capitals was just the most visible expression of a broader pattern seen throughout the eastern Mediterranean during the late Bronze Age. Kings and their elites set themselves apart from the rest of society, creating distinct and exclusive spaces. This is evident in the layout of royal cities everywhere, whether ruled by powerful empires or smaller kingdoms. In every case, certain neighborhoods were clearly reserved for the privileged few. In some cities, the quarters inhabited by rulers and their inner circles were outright fortresses. In Mycenaean Greece, citadels surrounded by massive cyclopean stone walls may have offered protection from foreign invaders, but they also reinforced the separation between rulers and ordinary people. Across the Aegean, in central Anatolia, the Hittite king lived in similar conditions,
Hattusa?
spanned a large area and was enclosed within a defensive wall. Access to the so-called upper city where the main temples were located was tightly controlled through a series of fortified gates, some of them adorned with sculpted figures. Within this already well-defended city, the royal compound stood, even more isolated. Today the site is still called Bikakal in Turkish, meaning Great Fortress. The citadel was built on a separate mountain outcrop, with steep ravines on its northern and eastern sides. A massive wall enclosed the entire complex, and entry was limited to just 3 heavily fortified gates. The geography of Greece and central Anatolia allowed rulers to build their citadels on mountain peaks, making them naturally defensible and separate from the surrounding population. But even in regions without such dramatic landscapes like other parts of the eastern Mediterranean, rulers still found ways to physically distance themselves from their subjects. In cities like Ugarit, Imar, and Carchemish in Syria, the royal quarters were built on elevated ground within the cities and enclosed by walls. In the Assyrian capital of Assur, the fortified old town home to the palace temples, an elite residences was built on higher ground and separated from the rest of the city by a massive wall with 3 fortified gates. The general population lived in the new town below. We don't have much direct evidence about how accessible these kings were, but it seems clear that very few people could approach them. For instance, the Assyrians left behind a set of decrees that tightly controlled access to the palace women, who lived in seclusion with no freedom of movement. While these restrictions likely stemmed from social norms around gender and sexuality, they also point to a guarded and inaccessible court. Similarly, a long Hittite protocol outlines the duties of the royal bodyguards. Though focused on ritual and security, it reinforces the idea that access to the king was tightly restricted. The broader structure of late Bronze Age societies in the eastern Mediterranean is still not fully understood, because most of the surviving records come from royal institutions like palaces and temples. It can appear as though kings controlled every aspect of life. Some scholars have gone so far as to argue that these societies revolved entirely around the royal household, and that other elite families were connected to the king in a network that functioned like an extended family. This idea aligns with Max Weber's patrimonial household model, however. A more balanced view sees these societies as divided into 2 main sectors, one that was attached to the palace and one that was not. The palace sector did dominate societal, politically, economically, and religiously, but alongside it was a village sector made up of independent rural communities. These villagers lived on land, they farmed as family units under the leadership of local elders. Their communities were generally egalitarian, and the people were mostly poor. Because their social and economic life was relatively simple, they didn't need complex bureaucracies, and as a result, they rarely show up in official records except when they interacted with palace institutions. In some areas, these independent village communities were more prominent than in others, but everywhere they seemed to face growing pressure and encroachment from the palace. Sector 1 example that reveals the collapse of independent village. Life comes from a region on the eastern edge of the Mitanni state, near the city of Nuzi. This small city was part of the kingdom of Arafa, located east of the Tigris River, and its king was a vassal of Mitanni. The archives from Nuzi, dating to the 15th century BCE, belonged to wealthy members of the palace elite who were eager to profit from agricultural land but faced legal restrictions that made this difficult. In that region, land wasn't individually owned. Instead, it was held jointly by families, and outright sales of land were either forbidden or heavily restricted to get around these rules. Some wealthy men came up with a legal loophole. They had themselves adopted by local villagers. In return for a gift, essentially a disguised purchase price, the elite adoptees received the right to use the family's land. One man named Hittites did this around 50 times, acquiring control over a vast amount of farmland. The villagers who adopted him often did so out of desperation, weighed down by debt. In exchange for settling those debts, Hittites took over their fields while allowing them to remain as tenant farmers. In this way, he gained access to both the land and the labor that worked it. Through these tactics, he and others like him, wealthy clients of the palace, were able to undermine or even erase the independence of rural communities. During the Late Bronze Age, the palace sector was far more powerful and extensive than the village sector. Scale and complexity dominate the historical record. In major states like Egypt and Babylonia, this had been true for centuries. Palace institutions absorbed most of the population into their networks. The development of large-scale irrigation systems, managed by the palace and fed by canal networks, helped concentrate economic power and further centralize control. This pattern held throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Everywhere, palaces controlled the economy and society, and they thrived until the eventual collapse of the Late Bronze Age system. These palace-centered societies were strictly hierarchical. A person's position was determined by birth and profession. Most people worked in specialized roles, often inherited from their fathers, providing services to the palace, whether in the bureaucracy, the military, or religious institutions. The majority of the population, however, were farmers and manual laborers tied to the land. While they weren't slaves in the legal sense, they weren't owned outright by a person or institution. They had limited freedom of movement and were obligated to provide goods and services to the palace. The upper levels of society lived in the cities, and those at the very top made up the king's inner circle. These elite individuals were likely the only ones allowed to live within the fortified citadels. They held power primarily in 3 areas of government: the military, administration, and religion. All 3 branches involved large numbers of people, though we don't know exactly how many. Each one had a detailed hierarchy with many ranks and titles. These varied from culture to culture and evolved over time, so we won't explore them in depth here. It's important to note that the titles people held often didn't reflect their actual duties. For example, the Hittite official known as the chief of the wine may originally have been a palace wine steward, but by the late 2nd millennium BCE, he had become a high-ranking military commander in charge of leading campaigns. This kind of title inflation was common across history. Terms that began in a household setting were retained even as the roles became powerful positions in state governance. The titles themselves don't tell us how far the power of their holders had expanded, despite cultural differences. There were many similarities in government structures across the Eastern Mediterranean in the Late Bronze Age. Every state maintained a military not just for defense, but often for expansion or plunder. Warfare played a central role in diplomacy and statecraft, and the army became a major arm of government. Most men were drafted to fight as part of the services they owed the palace. Military campaigns typically took place in the summer, after the harvest, when food could be gathered more easily along the way. Military technology had advanced significantly by this time. In the mid-2nd millennium BCE, a major innovation arrived in the Near East: the 2-wheeled, horse-drawn chariot, likely introduced from northern regions. By the start of the Late Bronze Age, every army included a chariot division, staffed by professional soldiers. Charioteers needed extensive training and skill, far more than the foot soldiers of earlier times. Their role was to ride to the front lines and fire arrows from a stationary position. Their only defense was a shield-bearer, who may also have wielded a spear. Chariots were expensive and complex. Each one needed not only materials to build, but to horses to pull at hand. usually one or two backup horses. A team of technicians was also required to maintain the chariots, though they were relatively few in number, perhaps one chariot per 100 infantrymen. They were a vital part of the army. The men who operated them belonged to the upper military ranks. In Syria, these elite charioteers were known as Marianu, a word that may come from the same root as a Vedic term meaning young man. Marianu were especially important in the armies of Mitanni and the smaller states in the Syro-Palestinian region. Over time, their elite status extended beyond the military. Marianu came to refer to members of the upper class in general, not just to soldiers. Warfare played a central role in international politics during the Late Bronze Age, since many states controlled foreign territories and were frequently involved in military conflict. Nearly all major powers and likely many smaller ones, as well maintained standing armies made up of professional soldiers. Alongside these full-time troops were conscripts and mercenaries, often recruited from marginalized groups on the fringes of society, such as the Habiru mentioned earlier in Chapter 3. It's extremely difficult to determine the actual size of these armies based on the historical records that have survived. Kings often exaggerated enemy numbers to make their victories sound more impressive, something that still happens today, such as in modern claims about the size of the Iraqi army. Even so, scholars have tried to estimate military sizes from such accounts. For example, the Hittite army at the famous Battle of Kadesh has been estimated at around 47,500 men. A recent study of warfare in New Kingdom Egypt suggests that the Egyptian regular army probably did not exceed 40,000 troops. That estimate is based on the assumption that, in a population of about 3 million, roughly 1% could serve as full-time soldiers, around 30,000 men, with another 10,000 drawn from conscripts serving a third of the year. These numbers are highly speculative, as they depend on a lot of uncertain data. Also, these estimates often don't include support staff, which would have been substantial. Every army relied on a wide range of non-combat personnel, servants, craftsmen, cooks, and others who handled logistics and daily needs. Asterisk, like all armies throughout history, these forces were structured according to a strict hierarchy. While the titles of ranks have survived in some cases, their exact functions are often unclear. There was some room for promotion based on merit. In the autobiography, inscribed in his tomb, the Egyptian soldier Amos, son of Abana, described how he was promoted to the rank of warrior of the ruler after demonstrating bravery in battle. Soldiers who excelled in the infantry sometimes advanced into the elite chariot divisions. Still, we don't have enough evidence to reconstruct a typical career path for soldiers in any army of the period. Promotions to the highest ranks were rarely based on ability alone. Family connections played a decisive role. In every major state, the king served as commander-in-chief. The top military positions just below him were usually filled by his relatives. In Hittite society, for instance, the crown prince held the second highest military rank, and the king's brother often served as commander of the royal bodyguards. This blending of dynastic privilege and military authority wasn't unusual, and in many ways it mirrors practices that still exist in modern times. The main difference is that ancient kings were often personally involved in battle. Unlike today's commanders-in-chief, who typically remained far from the front lines, in the Late Bronze Age, military men from modest backgrounds could rise to powerful positions in other areas of government. In Egypt, it was common for successful military officers to transition into high-ranking roles in the civil bureaucracy, something that rarely happened the other way around. Though uncommon, even the throne was not out of reach. During times of crisis, generals occasionally seized power. As seen with Harmhab and Ramesses I, after the instability following Akhenaten's reign, since being a warrior was considered a vital trait for a ruler, it made sense to the Egyptians that a capable military leader could also become king. Even lower-level government positions were open to experienced military men, and across the Eastern Mediterranean world, they often held considerable political influence. Just like the military, the civil government had many officials with specialized titles, though their exact responsibilities are often unclear today. These ancient states were highly centralized and complex, and the palaces oversaw most economic activity. Their economies worked on a redistributive model. The palace collected surplus resources, usually food and goods, from those working the land, and then redistributed those resources to state dependents. These dependents were often specialists, such as artisans or officials, who couldn't grow their own food because of their professional duties. Although we can't precisely measure how much land or food was involved or how many people were part of the system, we know it operated on a large scale. For example, the granaries at the Ramesses in western Thebes could hold over 16.5 million liters of grain. If fully distributed, that amount could feed around 3,400 families, or about 17,000 to 20,000 people for a whole year. Running a redistributive economy like this required a large, organized bureaucracy. Officials had to keep track of resources, assess what each person owed or contributed, and be held accountable if something went missing. These bureaucrats themselves were carefully monitored by supervisors, and the entire system needed oversight from someone at the top to ensure it all functioned smoothly. In Egypt, each government office had a very specific role, usually focusing on one task, such as quarrying, transport, or tax collection. And this kind of specialization probably existed in other states of the region too. Senior administrators often oversaw multiple offices to coordinate their work. A good example of such a high-ranking official is the vizier, one of the top positions in the Egyptian government. His responsibilities are listed in a text called The Duties of the Vizier, carved into several tomb walls. A modern scholar summarized the vizier's role like this: his job dealt almost entirely with administrative matters, maintaining civil order, overseeing taxes, managing archives and record-keeping, appointing and supervising officials, handling land disputes and property claims, inspecting local governments, monitoring natural events such as the Nile flood and crop conditions, and above all, administering civil law. In short, the vizier's role was both vast and highly detailed, and reflects the complexity of centralized government in the Late Bronze Age. Although all the major states in the Eastern Mediterranean shared similar government structures, they also had many differences, often based on their size and historical development. Among them, Egypt likely had the most complex bureaucracy. The country had a long tradition of centralized government and detailed record-keeping. And during the second half of the second millennium BCE, it revived and expanded that administrative system. The new kingdom's territorial expansion, especially into regions like Kush-Nubia, meant that Egypt had to manage new lands and increase the number of administrators. Since the Egyptians considered Nubia an integral part of their kingdom, they had to adjust their traditional division of Egypt into Upper and Lower Egypt. They created a new post, the king's son of Kush, to serve as the chief administrator of Nubia. At the other end of the spectrum, the Mycenaean principalities had the simplest bureaucracies. Their system of writing and record-keeping had only recently developed. The linear B script was fully adopted in Crete around 1430 BCE and spread to the Greek mainland later. These palaces ruled over smaller areas and had fewer people to manage directly. Their bureaucracies were small and mostly consisted of officials, known as collectors, who handled palace affairs and ensured resources flowed into the central administration. We don't have complete documentation from any of these societies that would allow us to fully reconstruct their administrative hierarchies, just as it would likely be difficult for someone thousands of years from now to understand the entire structure of a modern government. Still, it's clear that these ancient civil services were large and complex, and they required people with very specific training. Running a bureaucracy requires people who can read and write, skills we often take for granted today, but in the largely illiterate societies of the Late Bronze Age, literacy was rare. Those who were trained as scribes were highly respected and held important roles. An Egyptian saying captured the benefits of being a scribe: be a scribe, so that your limbs will be sleek and your hands will grow soft, that you may go forth in white clothes and be honored with courtiers saluting you. Scribes were sometimes the only professionals to sign their work, in contrast to artists, sculptors, or even authors, who typically remained anonymous. In the Near East, Babylonian traditions dominated scribal culture, and Babylonian trained. Scribes often traveled to foreign courts, where they likely held prestigious positions. Scribal education was usually institutionalized, but took place in private homes, and the role of scribe often passed from father to son. However, it's unclear how many government officials were actually literate. In Egypt, high-ranking officials often listed scribe among their titles, suggesting they could read and write. But this wasn't the case in other cultures. It's very possible that many senior officials, like viziers or overseers of granaries, didn't read the reports themselves, but instead relied on professional secretaries to interpret and relay the information. Just like in the military, there was no fixed path for rising through the ranks in the bureaucracy. Some Egyptian officials who reached high office claimed to have come from humble beginnings, though that might have been a common storytelling device rather than the truth. While skill and experience may have played a role in their advancement, one thing was certain: the king's favor was essential. Every appointment came directly from the king, and he could revoke it at any time. Loyalty was a highly valued trait. In Hittite society, officials had to swear an oath of loyalty to the king. The idea that one served the king personally, not the state, was clearly demonstrated in Assyrian coronation rituals. Asterisk, when a new king came to power. High officials would symbolically lay down the tools of their office in front of him. The high and second viziers would set down their staffs. The chief of finances would place his purse. The chief musician would present his harp, and all others offered whatever symbol represented their position. Then they would step aside, and the king would say, "Everyone keeps his post." They would bow, approach, and reclaim their positions. The king allowed it. Despite the formal process, many top offices stayed within powerful families for generations. Just like in royal courts throughout history, those close to the king or queen often arranged for their sons, daughters, or relatives to take over their roles. These elite families not only worked near the king, they lived close to him too, often in restricted access areas inside the fortified citadels. Their homes often had private archives, allowing us today to trace their roles and personal lives. Asterisk, one good example is the Ushered Shirua family of Assur. Their house, it's only about 100 meters from the palace, contained records from 3 generations of the family. They had managed grain distribution in the Upper Habur region of Syria. As powerful administrators, they received visits and gifts from people hoping to win their favor, including bribes like slaves. The family kept meticulous records of both these dealings and their personal affairs, such as house sales and loans, and what seems to have been their own home. This practice wasn't unusual. Many Near Eastern cities archaeologists have found similar household archives combining private and professional documents, such as at Ugarit. This blend of personal and official record-keeping was common throughout the region, not something new or unique to the Late Bronze Age. Alongside the palaces, temples were the largest and most important institutions in the Late Bronze Age, state sept in the Mycenaean world, where independent temples didn't exist. Temples weren't just places of worship. They were large estates, supporting the gods and the many people who served them. Just as the king was the head of the palace, the god was seen as the head of the temple. And a whole workforce of priests and laborers worked the temple's land and managed its resources. The domains of major temples could be vast, requiring many people and a system of administration to oversee it all. Because rituals were essential to kingship, and no ritual was complete without offerings, temples needed significant resources: food, drink, incense, and luxury items for the gods. Temples weren't separate from the state, they were deeply integrated into state structures. Their role was to ensure the gods remained favorable to the kingdom. The king himself was the chief priest. And in Egypt, for example, he was often depicted personally performing temple rituals. But the scale of religious activity meant that a large priesthood was necessary to serve the gods' daily needs. These priests held various roles and ranks. Some worked full-time, while others only served part-time in Egypt. The full-time temple staff were called servants of the god, often translated as prophets, a term borrowed from Greek. The part-time priests, known as the pure ones, were divided into 4 rotating groups, each serving for 1 month at a time. Although we don't have as much documentation for other late Bronze Age states, similar systems likely existed. In Babylonia, for instance, temple workers had long been a mix of full and part-timers, and there's no reason to believe this changed in the later period. For many people, getting a job in the temple wasn't just a religious calling, it was a practical and economic decision. Being a priest meant receiving a share of the temple's offerings, known as prebends. Even a small share was enough to provide a stable supply of food and drink. Those with money often bought temple positions as a way to secure long-term income and social status. In theory, the king appointed all the priests, but in reality, this was often just a formality. Local officials likely chose the regional temple. Staff and priestly positions tended to stay in families. Sons often succeeded their fathers. Like other branches of government, temples had a complex hierarchy of positions, and people could work their way up. One well-documented case is that of Bacon Khans, an Egyptian from the 13th century BCE, who described his long and distinguished career in several inscriptions. He spent 4 years as a student, then 11 years working in the royal stables under King Seti I. He became a low-ranking priest for 4 years, before joining the group of Amun's prophets. Over time, he steadily rose through the ranks. 12 years as a regular prophet, 15 as a third-ranking prophet, 12 more as second-ranking, and then at least 27 years as the high priest of Amun. By the time he died, he had served in the temple for about 70 years. While his career length might have been unusual and possibly exaggerated, it's likely that many high-ranking priests were experienced professionals with considerable personal influence. Our modern distinction between the military, civil, and religious sectors doesn't quite fit the ancient world. People often moved between these spheres or held roles in more than one at once. For instance, Egyptian military leaders sometimes ended their careers in civil administration. Still, the practice of elite officials collecting multiple titles, common feature in earlier times, seems to have faded as roles became more specialized. They demanded people with specific training and experience. Technically, the king had the power to appoint or remove anyone from office, but in practice, his choices were probably limited by local politics and traditions. However, kings could and did override local hierarchies when they wanted. For example, early in his reign, Ramesses II appointed Nebu-Ninef, a priest from Middle Egypt, as the new high priest of Amun in Thebes. This likely disrupted the local elite, who may have expected one of their own to be promoted. To keep his government stable, the king needed to ensure that his officials remained loyal and satisfied. This was easier when the kingdom was economically prosperous and militarily successful. Victory in war benefited all levels of government. High-ranking military officers often welcomed warfare, gave them more power, responsibility, and resources, not to mention prestige. Even regular soldiers stood to gain from victory. The autobiography of Amos, son of Abana, tells how, after proving his bravery in battle, he was rewarded with gold, slaves, then land. In the late Bronze Age, war was nearly constant, making the military central to government life. Even in peacetime, the army likely held considerable political influence, thanks to its control over force and coercion. Civil servants also benefited when states expanded. As empires imposed their bureaucratic systems on new territories, they needed experienced administrators, usually only available from the heartland. These officials were dispatched to newly conquered regions, which expanded their careers and influence. For instance, the Assyrians established administrative centers in key areas across conquered Syrian territory and staffed them with officials from Assyria, deliberately isolating them from the local populations. Similarly, the Egyptians created towns in Nubia that housed administrators sent from Egypt. As the state's wealth and territory grew, so did its need for bureaucratic oversight. More income and goods required more officials to manage them, which increased the power and importance of the civil service. But perhaps the greatest beneficiaries of imperial success were the temples. The close relationship between gods and kings meant that every royal act required divine approval. to maintain favor with the gods and, with the powerful priesthoods, kings showered the temples with wealth. Across the region, excluding the Mycenaean world, which had no independent temples, kings built new temples or enlarged and renovated older ones. They donated elaborately crafted statues, furniture, ritual vessels, and other luxurious items. In Mesopotamia, where buildings were made mostly of mud brick, temples needed frequent repair. Although inscriptions about such projects are relatively scarce, many that do exist highlight work done on temples. In Egypt, temple construction during this period was particularly intense. The city of Thebes became covered with religious complexes. Nearly every ruler of the new kingdom added something to the great temple of Amun-Re at Karnak Chapel, a gate, an obelisk, or a statue. These projects were public statements of piety and power. For example, Queen Hatshepsut proudly described in her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri how she carved, transported, and erected 4 monolithic obelisks in honor of Amun. New temples sprang up across Egypt and Nubia, particularly under rulers like Amenhotep III and Ramesses II, who built them in large numbers. Temples also gained from military victories. As much of the spoils of war ended up in their treasuries, Tiglath-Pileser I, an Assyrian king, repeatedly boasted in his annals about the valuable gifts he offered to the gods from conquered lands. Then I gave the god Ashur a bronze vat and a bronze bathtub taken from the booty and tribute of the land of Katmu. I gave the god Adad, who loves me, 60 copper kettles. These royal offerings, though grand, were still modest compared to what the Egyptians amassed over time. One notable example is found in a relief by Thutmose III ruled, 1479 to 1425 BCE, carved on a wall at Karnak. It depicts the vast booty he presented to the god Amun after his military campaigns in Syria. The items are shown in ranked registers based on their value, with the most valuable like gold depicted in the greatest detail. The gold alone amounted to over 13,800 kilograms in ingots, along with a wide array of intricately decorated vessels and boxes over the centuries. Egypt's temples must have accumulated incredible riches in their treasuries. However, these treasures were symbolic. They were meant to bring prestige to the temple and the king who donated them. The priests themselves didn't use this treasure directly. Instead, their wealth and daily needs came from the temple estates, especially their agricultural lands. Kings could secure priestly support by expanding these temple holdings. Asterisk once again. Egypt provides the clearest documentation. Ramesses IV ruled 1156 to 1150 BCE, left behind a long papyrus known as Papyrus Harris-I that recorded the vast donations. His father, Ramesses III, had made 2 temples. The scale is astonishing. Ramesses III granted 2,954 square kilometers of farmland, 2 temples across. Egypt about 15% of the country's total farmland. He also donated over 107,000 male laborers, which could have represented 3% of the total population when accounting for their families. These temple dependents may have numbered close to 500,000 people. More than 80% of these donations went to the temples of Thebes. Based on this, many scholars believe that by this time, Egyptian temples controlled roughly 1/3 of all the land in the country. Temple estates were managed in several ways, as described in the later Papyrus Wilbur from the reign of Ramesses V, 1150 to 1145 BCE. According to this document, temple land was cultivated in 3 main ways: direct management by temple officials, who oversaw large farms. These officials collected 30% of the harvest for the temple's use, with the remaining 70% going toward costs like food rations for workers, leased land rented to small-scale farmers, who paid a modest 6% of their yield. As a fee, this helped sustain a large population likely made up of dependents of the state and temples, small plots assigned to temple officials, as a supplement to their rations and pay. This system allowed the king, as the supreme head of all government institutions, to reward his servants and officials with food, land, and gifts. The king was the central figure. Ideally, he provided for everyone. This ideal is illustrated in images from Akhenaten's reign. where at the window of appearances the king is shown showering his courtiers with gold, jewelry, and providing food and drink to the common people. In return, they pledged their loyalty and admiration. But the system only worked when the king had enough resources to support it. Egypt entered the new kingdom flush with wealth from military victories. Early on, the royal coffers overflowed. But later, as the Hittites gradually pushed Egypt out of its Asian territories, these resources began to shrink.